began with a dream, or so I thought. But as I sit here now, clutching the pen with trembling hands, I know it was much more than that. The room around me feels suffocating. The faint glow of the desk lamp barely pushing back the encroaching shadows that flicker unnaturally against the walls. It started 3 nights ago, when I first woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding and drenched in sweat, with the haunting image of a corridor burned into my mind. It was long, impossibly so, stretching out into the void with no end in sight, its walls adorned with what looked like distorted photographs, their grotesque subjects shifting and twisting as if alive. At first, I chalked it up to a nightmare, but the same vision came back the next night, and the night after that, each time clearer, sharper, and more vivid. By the 4th night, I began to notice something else. Faint footsteps echoing just behind me as I walked down the corridor in the dream, though when I turned, there was nothing but the oppressive blackness of the endless hall. The air smelled of mildew and decay, thick with a dampness that clung to my skin even after I awoke, leaving me feeling unclean. On the 5th night, I realized it wasn't just a dream. I had somehow carried something back with me. I awoke to find scratches on my arms, deep and deliberate, spelling out words I could not understand. Jagged symbols that burned when I tried to wash them away. Each day, the symbols multiplied, forming a sinister language that pulsed with an unnatural heat beneath my skin. On the 6th night, the corridor changed. The walls began to close in, the shifting photographs now whispering incoherent words in a cacophony of voices that sounded like a mix of agony and ecstasy. I ran, desperate to escape, but the corridor seemed to stretch infinitely, mocking my every step. That was when I saw her, a woman at the far end of the hall, her back turned to me, her hair cascading down like an oil slick that moved as though alive. I froze, paralyzed by the sight of her swaying unnaturally, as if beckoning me forward without turning around. Against my better judgment, I moved closer, the whispers growing louder, until I realized the words were forming my name. My blood ran cold as I reached out, unable to stop myself, and that's when she turned. Her face, or what remained of it, was a hollow void, a swirling blackness that seemed to pull at my soul, drawing me in. I screamed, but no sound escaped. Instead, the air around me warped, and I felt myself being sucked into that endless, screaming abyss where time and space no longer had meaning. I woke up gasping, but I wasn't in my bed. I was back in the corridor, only this time I wasn't alone. The walls were alive, pulsing with something organic, and faces. My face stared back at me from every inch of the grotesque surface. The woman was everywhere, her hollow gaze following me, her whisper now a roar that shattered any thought of escape. I ran until my legs gave out, but the corridor never ended, and when I looked down, I saw that my hands had begun to dissolve, turning into the same black void that consumed her face. Now, I am part of it, writing these words with fingers that no longer feel real, the whispers now coming from my own mouth as I try to warn you. If you dream of the corridor, don't walk into it. Don't follow the whispers, because once you step inside, you don't come out. I don't know when the mirror in my bedroom became something more than a reflective surface, but I remember the first time it felt wrong, when it stared back at me with more than my own reflection. It was a month ago, maybe more. The days have blurred together now, and I no longer trust time to behave as it should. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting movement in the corner of my vision, a shimmer that shouldn't have been there. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the tricks escalated. One night, while brushing my teeth, I noticed my reflection blinked a fraction of a second after I did. It wasn't immediate, not enough to scream, but just enough to unsettle me, like watching a puppet mimic its master. I stood frozen, staring into the glass, trying to convince myself that it was a delayed reaction in my tired mind. But the more I stared, the more I noticed the reflection didn't quite match. My reflection's eyes were darker, emptier, like something hollow was looking back at me, and its mouth, though still and silent, seemed to curl ever so slightly when I looked away. I covered the mirror that night with a bedsheet, hoping that would be the end of it, but covering it only seemed to anger whatever resided inside. I woke up to the sound of scratching. Not faint, not subtle, but loud, deliberate, and coming from behind the mirror. My heart pounded as I approached it, the sheet now sagging from where something inside had pressed against it. I ripped it away, and for a moment the mirror was just that, a mirror. My terrified face stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale, but then I noticed it. The reflection of my room was wrong. It was darker, the shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own, and the version of me in the glass didn't seem scared. It looked amused. I backed away, but my reflection didn't. It stayed where it was, staring at me as I stumbled backward, its eyes following me with a sinister calm that made my blood run cold. I tried smashing the mirror the next day, desperate to rid myself of its presence. I swung a hammer at it with all my strength, but the glass didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. Instead, the hammer bounced back as if I'd struck solid steel, the force nearly dislocating my wrist. And then, for the first time, my reflection spoke. Its voice didn't come from the glass, but from inside my own head, low and guttural, vibrating through my skull like a swarm of insects crawling through my brain. "You can't break me. I'm already inside." The words sent me spiraling into a panic, and I fled the house, refusing to return for days. When I finally did, the mirror was waiting, uncovered, standing in the middle of my bedroom as if it had moved on its own. I knew then that I couldn't escape it, that it wasn't just in the room, it was in me. Over the following weeks, the reflection began to grow bolder. At first, it only moved when I wasn't looking, its position slightly different every time I glanced back. Then it started stepping out of sync with me entirely, pacing back and forth while I stood still, its eyes boring into mine like it was studying me, dissecting me. The night it stepped out of the glass was the night I knew I was truly damned. I woke to the sound of heavy breathing, but it wasn't mine. My room was bathed in an unnatural glow, and standing at the foot of my bed was the reflection, my reflection, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dark. It smiled then, a wide, grotesque grin that stretched far beyond the limits of what my face should be capable of. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if my voice had been stolen, swallowed by the thing standing before me. It leaned in close, its breath cold and foul, and whispered, "You're free now. I'll take it from here." Then it vanished, leaving the mirror empty for the first time in weeks. But it wasn't gone. I knew deep down that it had taken my place, that the version of me walking around in the world wasn't me at all. I tried reaching out to people, calling friends and family, but every time they answered, I could hear my own voice speaking to them from somewhere else. It was always a step ahead of me, always one move closer to erasing me completely. Now, I sit here, trapped in this house with no reflection, no shadow, no proof that I even exist. The mirror is gone, but I still feel its presence, watching, waiting. I can hear the whispers growing louder, telling me that it's not over, that it's never over. And as I write this, I realize the worst truth of all. The reflection didn't just take my place in the world, it took my soul. I never wanted to move into that house, an old, decaying mansion on the edge of town, shrouded in fog so thick it seemed to absorb the light. My parents, ever the optimists, called it a fixer-upper. But there was something about the place that made my stomach twist the moment I stepped through the creaking front door. The air inside felt heavier, colder, as though the walls themselves were exhaling a breath that carried years of abandonment and something worse, something unseen. My room was the worst part of all. It was on the top floor, with a single window that overlooked the overgrown garden and an old oak tree that clawed at the glass whenever the wind picked up. It started small, almost unnoticeable. Faint creaks in the middle of the night, the soft groan of wood settling. My parents said it was the house adjusting, but it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, calculated, like someone or something was pacing just outside my door. Then came the whispers. They started on the second week, soft and unintelligible at first, like distant conversations just out of earshot. I told myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew the sound was coming from inside the house. They grew louder each night, evolving into a chorus of voices that overlapped and echoed through the halls. Sometimes they sounded like my parents, calling my name from somewhere far below, but when I checked, they were always asleep in their room. One night, I woke up to the distinct feeling of being watched. My room was pitch black, save for the pale sliver of moonlight slicing through the window. I tried to move, but my body refused. It was as if something invisible pressed down on my chest, pinning me in place. That's when I saw it. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, standing in the corner of my room. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but its presence was suffocating. A silent predator waiting for me to close my eyes. The next morning, I convinced myself it was sleep paralysis, but deep down, I knew better. I tried to tell my parents, but they dismissed it as nerves, the product of an overactive imagination. The following week, I started noticing changes in the house itself. The wallpaper in the hallway peeled back, revealing strange symbols etched into the plaster beneath. Twisted, arcane designs that seemed to pulse when I stared too long. Doors that had always been locked were now ajar, leading to rooms I didn't recognize, filled with antique furniture covered in dust and mirrors that reflected things that weren't there. The house began to feel alive, its walls pulsating faintly as though it had a heartbeat. One night, I woke to find the oak tree outside my window was gone, replaced by an empty void that swallowed the horizon. The whispers were louder than ever, now forming distinct words. Come closer, come see. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I followed them, my bare feet patting down the cold wooden floor of the hallway. The whispers led me to the basement door, which I was certain had been locked since we moved in. It stood open now, revealing a staircase that descended into a darkness so complete it felt like staring into the end of the world. As I stepped down, the air grew colder, heavier, and the faint sound of breathing filled the space around me. At the bottom, I found a door, ancient and made of wood so rotten it should have fallen apart long ago. Carved into it were the same symbols I'd seen on the walls upstairs, glowing faintly as though alive. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming to turn back, but the whispers had grown louder, more insistent, almost desperate. When I pushed the door open, I wished I hadn't. The room beyond was vast and impossible, stretching far beyond the boundaries of the house. The walls were made of flesh, pulsing and writhing as though the house itself were alive. Suspended in the center was a figure, or what remained of one. A grotesque amalgamation of limbs, faces, and organs, twisting together in a horrifying display of agony and power. Its many mouths moved in unison, forming words that I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. "Welcome," it said, though the voice came from everywhere and nowhere. I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to comprehend the impossible sight. The thing moved, its limbs extending like tendrils, reaching for me. I ran, tearing up the stairs two at a time, but the house fought back. The walls shifted, closing in, and the floor buckled beneath my feet. By the time I reached my room, the door slammed shut behind me, and I could hear the whispers screaming now, furious and relentless. I haven't left my room since. The house won't let me. The window shows nothing but blackness, and the door won't budge no matter how hard I pull. I can hear it breathing, louder now, closer, and the whispers have turned to laughter. The symbols on my walls glow faintly, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. If you find this, please don't come looking for me. Burn the house. Destroy it. Whatever lives here is older than time, and it's hungry. The small, unassuming clock shop on the corner of Whitlow Street had always been a curiosity to me. Its dusty windows filled with ancient timepieces that ticked and talked in chaotic unison. It was the kind of place you walked past without a second thought, except something about it always drew my gaze. A pull I couldn't explain. One rainy evening, curiosity finally overpowered caution, and I stepped inside, instantly regretting my decision. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and metal, the oppressive ticking of countless clocks filling every corner of the dimly lit room. Behind the counter stood an old man, hunched and silent, his face obscured by shadows that seemed unnaturally thick despite the warm glow of the hanging lamps. His eyes, when they met mine, were like twin black holes, endless and consuming. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge me, yet I felt as though he were weighing my soul. I almost turned and left, but then my eyes fell on a peculiar clock sitting on a shelf behind him. A sleek, black timepiece with strange symbols etched into its surface and hands that moved backward, counter to every other clock in the shop. "That one," I said, pointing to it without understanding why. The old man's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, and without a word, he reached for the clock, wrapping it carefully in a piece of cloth before handing it to me. His bony fingers brushed mine as I took it, and I felt a chill race through me, colder than the rain outside. He named no price, simply nodding as if dismissing me. The moment I stepped back into the street, the door behind me slammed shut with a finality that sent shivers down my spine. I brought the clock home, placing it on my mantel where its backward ticking filled the room, a strangely soothing sound that quickly became a constant presence. That night, I dreamt of endless corridors filled with clocks, their faces twisted and warped, their hands spinning wildly. In the dream, I was running, chased by a shadowy figure whose footsteps echoed like the tick of a monstrous clock. I woke drenched in sweat, the backward ticking of the clock louder than ever. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Time itself seemed to distort around me. Hours would pass in the blink of an eye, or minutes would stretch into agonizing eternities. My reflection in the mirror started to change. It moved independently, blinking when I didn't, its expression growing more haggard with each passing day. People I knew began acting strangely as well, their words stuttering and repeating like a broken record, their eyes glazing over as though they were caught in some temporal loop. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, but then I noticed something horrifying. The clock's hands weren't just moving backward, they were counting down. I tried to get rid of it, throwing it into the trash, but when I returned home, it was back on the mantel, ticking louder than ever. I smashed it with a hammer, but the next morning, it was whole again, its countdown continuing unabated. Desperate, I returned to the clock shop, but the building was gone, replaced by an empty lot filled with weeds and debris. Panicked, I sought out anyone who might know about the shop, but no one remembered it ever existing. The clock's countdown reached its final hours, and I began to hear whispers, faint and insidious, coming from the clock itself. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but their meaning was clear. A promise of doom, of something unimaginable waiting for me when the countdown ended. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what might happen when the clock struck 0. As the final minutes ticked away, reality itself began to unravel around me. The walls of my house twisted and groaned, shadows moving of their own accord. Time no longer held any meaning. I would blink and find myself in a different room, or staring at a younger version of myself, wide-eyed and terrified. When the clock's hands finally reached 0, the world went silent. The whispers stopped, the shadows froze, and for a brief moment, there was peace. Then the clock began to chime, each toll resonating with a power that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The room around me shattered like glass, and I found myself standing in an endless void, the ground beneath my feet made of ticking gears and spinning cogs. The old man from the shop was there, his face no longer obscured. It was worse than I could have imagined. His skin was pale and stretched thin, his mouth filled with sharp, jagged teeth that clicked together as he smiled. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing like 100 ticking clocks. "You are now part of the mechanism." Before I could scream, the ground gave way, and I fell, tumbling through an endless maze of gears and machinery. My body twisted and stretched, pulled apart and reassembled in impossible ways. I became part of the clock, my heartbeat syncing with its ticking, my screams lost in the cacophony of endless time. Now I exist in the void, my mind trapped in the gears of a machine that spans eternity. I don't know how long it's been, minutes, years, centuries. Time has no meaning here, only the constant, unrelenting ticking. If you ever find yourself in a small clock shop on the corner of Whitlow Street, do yourself a favor. Don't go inside. Leave, run, and never look back. Because once you hear the ticking, it's already too late. I had always been drawn to solitude, preferring the whisper of wind through trees to the chatter of people, which is why I moved to the edge of an ancient forest that had no name on any map I could find. Locals called it cursed, but their vague warnings only added to its allure. The first week was blissful, days spent hiking through endless greenery, nights filled with the soothing sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. It wasn't until I ventured deeper, beyond the trails marked by faded signs and crumbling cairns, that I began to notice how wrong the forest truly was. The trees grew unnaturally close together, their branches tangling above to blot out the sun, casting everything in an eternal twilight. The air became still, suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I discovered strange carvings on the bark of trees, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked too long. Animal paths were lined with bones, arranged in patterns too deliberate to be natural. I should have turned back, but something deeper, curiosity or perhaps the forest itself, drew me forward. On the third day of my exploration, I came across a clearing dominated by a massive tree unlike any I'd seen before. Its bark was black as charcoal, its roots twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed almost human. At its base was an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and engraved with the same shifting symbols I'd seen before. The air around the tree hummed with an unnatural energy, and I felt a pull, an invitation or a warning. That night, I woke to the sound of whispers, faint and incomprehensible, coming from just outside my cabin. I grabbed a flashlight, heart pounding, and stepped onto the porch. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual night sounds absent. My beam caught movement, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was humanoid but impossibly tall, its limbs long and twisted, its face obscured by shadows that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. It didn't move, didn't react, but I felt its gaze boring into me, colder than the night air. I retreated inside, locking the doors and windows, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. Over the next few days, the forest began to encroach on my cabin. Vines crept up the walls, their growth unnaturally fast, their tendrils scratching against the windows like skeletal fingers. The trees outside seemed to move closer each time I looked, their gnarled branches reaching for the roof. The whispers became voices, distinct and accusing, calling my name in tones that shifted from mocking to mournful. Sleep became impossible, my dreams filled with visions of the black tree and the altar, the symbols burning into my mind. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I ventured back into the forest, drawn by the whispers that now felt less like a torment and more like a command. The path twisted and shifted, leading me to places I didn't recognize, even though I'd walked these trails a dozen times. The forest seemed alive, its trees leaning in as though watching, the ground pulsing faintly beneath my feet. I found myself back at the clearing, the black tree looming larger than before. The altar was no longer covered in moss. It gleamed as though freshly polished, its surface wet with a dark, viscous liquid that dripped onto the roots below. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices that drowned out my thoughts. My body moved of its own accord, stepping closer to the altar. As I touched it, a searing pain shot through me, and the world dissolved into darkness. When I woke, I was still in the forest, but everything had changed. The trees were larger, their bark pulsating like flesh. The sky above was an endless void, black and starless. The whispers were gone, replaced by a low, guttural growl that came from everywhere and nowhere. I realized, with a sinking dread, that the forest had claimed me. My body felt wrong, heavier, slower, as though weighed down by unseen chains. When I stumbled to a nearby stream, the reflection that stared back at me was no longer my own. My skin was pale and bark-like, my eyes hollow and glowing faintly. I was becoming one of them, one of the forest's guardians, bound to its eternal, cursed existence. I don't know how long I've been here now, days, years, centuries. Time doesn't exist in this place. The forest is all there is, stretching endlessly, its darkness consuming everything. I can feel it growing, spreading, reaching for the world beyond. If you ever find yourself near an ancient forest with no name, turn back. Burn it if you can. But whatever you do, don't step inside. The forest is alive, and it hungers for more. It began on a humid summer evening when I moved into the old, decrepit apartment building at the edge of town. A building with a history so thick with rumors that even the bravest avoided it. I didn't care about the whispered warnings. Rent was cheap, and I was desperate. The peeling paint on the walls, the cracked windows, and the perpetual smell of dampness didn't bother me at first. It was the oppressive silence that felt wrong. A kind of quiet that pressed against my eardrums and made me hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the building. My first night was restless, filled with odd noises. Faint tapping on the walls, a distant sound of something dragging across the floor above, and what I thought was a whisper right outside my door. Dismissing it as my overactive imagination, I tried to sleep, only to wake up at precisely 3:33 a.m. to find my bedroom door ajar. I was certain I had locked it. The following days brought more unsettling occurrences. My belongings would be out of place. My toothbrush moved to the kitchen, my shoes lined up in odd patterns I hadn't arranged. Once, I found my old photo album spread open on the floor, the pictures of my childhood scratched and blurred as though someone had dragged a clawed finger across them. Then came the shadows. At first, they were subtle. A fleeting darkness in the corner of my vision or an unusual distortion in the dim light of my living room. but soon they became more pronounced. I'd see them darting across the hallway or lingering just beyond the edge of the light in my bedroom. One night, as I was washing dishes, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Turning around, I caught sight of a shadowy figure standing in the hallway. A figure darker than the night itself, its form indistinct but its presence oppressive. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt its gaze, heavy and piercing. When I blinked, it was gone, but the feeling of being watched never left. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it, standing at the foot of my bed or crouching in the corner of my room. I tried to convince myself it was stress, that the creaking floorboards and shifting shadows were tricks of my mind, but deep down I knew better. One night, driven by desperation, I decided to stay awake and confront whatever was haunting me. I armed myself with a flashlight and sat in the living room, waiting. Hours passed, and the oppressive silence grew heavier, the air thick with an unseen presence. Then, at 3:33 a.m., the lights flickered and went out. My flashlight sputtered as I swung it around the room, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. Standing in the corner, its form taller and darker than before, its edges writhing like smoke. This time, it moved, gliding toward me with an unnatural grace. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat as the shadow enveloped me, its cold, suffocating presence pressing against my skin. It didn't attack or harm me. It simply watched, its formless face inches from mine, as if studying me. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving me gasping for air and trembling with terror. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The next morning, I packed what little I had and left, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. But even after moving to a new place, the shadow followed. I'd see it in mirrors, in reflections on polished surfaces, or lurking in the periphery of my vision. It never spoke, never touched me, but its presence was constant, a silent reminder that it was always watching. I became a recluse, afraid to go out or let anyone into my life for fear the shadow would latch onto them too. My nights were spent huddled in corners, every light in my apartment blazing, though it never seemed to keep the darkness at bay. Friends stopped calling, work became impossible, and my life unraveled. I tried everything to rid myself of it. Blessings, exorcisms, even burning sage, but nothing worked. The shadow was part of me now, a parasite that fed on my fear and despair. Then one night, as I sat in the dark, staring into the reflective surface of my TV, I saw it again. But this time, it wasn't outside the glass, it was inside. The realization hit me like a blow. The shadow wasn't just watching me. It was me, or at least some part of me I couldn't comprehend. And as I stared into its void-like form, I felt it staring back, a reflection of every fear, regret, and dark thought I'd ever had. I don't know how much time has passed since then. Days blur into nights, and the shadow grows stronger, its presence more tangible. I've stopped leaving my apartment, stopped eating, stopped trying to fight. There's no point. I can feel it consuming me, my mind unraveling like thread on a spool. If you ever feel the weight of eyes on you when no one's around, if you catch glimpses of movement in the corner of your vision, turn away. Don't look. Don't acknowledge it. Because once you see it, once it knows you've seen it, there's no escape. It will watch you, follow you, and eventually it will become you. There's a lake deep in the heart of the forest that nobody speaks about. It's not marked on any map, and the few who know of it pretend it doesn't exist. But I found it one fateful summer when my curiosity outpaced my caution. It was the kind of place that seemed trapped in time, crystal clear water that reflected the dense canopy above, and an eerie stillness that wrapped the area like a shroud. No birds sang near it, no insects buzzed, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I was on a solo hiking trip, looking to escape the humdrum of my monotonous life, when I stumbled upon it by sheer accident. The sight of it stopped me dead in my tracks. It was beautiful, but not in a way that invited you to stay. Felt wrong, like I was intruding somewhere I didn't belong. I told myself it was just a lake, that the chills running up my spine were nothing more than fatigue, and decided to set up camp nearby. As night fell, the quiet became oppressive. I hadn't realized how much I relied on the sounds of the forest to feel grounded until they were gone. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence so thick it felt like cotton stuffed in my ears. Lying in my tent, I tried to sleep, but the silence was deafening. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like wind passing through reeds, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the murmur of one voice, but many, overlapping, blending into a symphony of incoherent words. I unzipped my tent and looked out, expecting to see another hiker or maybe a prankster. But there was no one. Only the lake, shimmering under the moonlight, as if calling to me. I should have stayed inside, zipped up, and waited for morning. But something pulled me toward the water, an inexplicable urge I couldn't resist. The whispers grew louder as I approached, forming half-words and fragmented phrases. They were pleading, accusing, crying out in anguish. The surface of the lake was unnaturally still, reflecting the moon in perfect clarity. And then I saw them. Faces, hundreds, maybe thousands, just beneath the surface, pale and distorted, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, but I couldn't look away. One face rose closer, its features becoming sharper, more defined. It was a woman, her hair floating around her like seaweed, her eyes locked on mine. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. And then, without warning, she lunged upward, breaking the surface with a splash that shattered the oppressive silence. I ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted back to my tent. But the whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic. They were inside my head, filling it with their cries. When I reached my tent, it was gone. My gear, my supplies. Everything had vanished as if I had never been there. Panic set in as I realized I was utterly alone, miles from civilization, with no way to navigate the dense forest in the dark. I spent the rest of the night sitting with my back against a tree, clutching a stick for protection, as the whispers ebbed and flowed around me. By morning, the lake was gone. Where it had been was nothing but dry earth, cracked and barren as though it had never held water. I stumbled back to the nearest trail, every step weighed down by an unseen force, as if the forest itself was trying to keep me from leaving. When I finally made it back to town and tried to tell someone what I had experienced, they dismissed me as delirious from dehydration. But I knew what I saw. Weeks passed, and I couldn't shake the memory of the lake. I stopped sleeping, haunted by dreams of the faces in the water, their hollow eyes and gaping mouths. I heard the whispers even in the daylight, faint and distant, but unmistakable. I tried to research the area, digging through old maps and archives, but found nothing about a lake. Yet, the more I searched, the louder the whispers became, as if warning me to stop. Then, one night, I woke to find my room filled with water. It wasn't real. I knew that, but it felt real. My bed was submerged. My lungs burned as if they were filling with liquid, and the faces were there, floating just out of reach. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. And then I understood. They weren't warning me. They were calling me. I don't know how much time I have left. The whispers grow stronger every day, and the faces, they're everywhere now. In mirrors, in puddles, even in the glint of sunlight on glass. I've stopped leaving the house, afraid that one day I'll see the lake again. But deep down, I know it's inevitable. The lake wasn't just a place. It's a door, and it's coming for me. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods, and you hear the whispers, turn back. Don't look for the lake. Don't let it find you, because once it does, it won't let you go. I had always been a creature of habit, my life a monotonous cycle of work, home, and sleep, until that fateful evening when I decided to take the long way home, seeking solace in the quiet hum of my car's engine and the rhythmic passing of streetlights. The city was unusually empty, the streets bathed in the soft glow of lamplights casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. As I drove, the familiar landmarks blurred into a tapestry of indistinct shapes, and a sense of unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach. It was then that I noticed it, a fleeting glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, but as the seconds ticked by, the sensation of being watched intensified. My heart began to race, and a cold sweat formed on my brow. I glanced into the mirror again, this time more deliberately, but saw nothing. The road ahead remained empty, the silence oppressive. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to fatigue, but the unease lingered, gnawing at me. The cityscape gradually gave way to the outskirts, the buildings thinning out, replaced by stretches of open fields and dense patches of forest. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into unfamiliar territory. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows that danced and flickered with each curve. It was then that I saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, its outline barely visible in the dim light. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, to ignore the figure and continue on my way, but something compelled me to slow down. As I approached, the figure became clearer, a woman, her face obscured by a hood, her posture hunched as if burdened by an unseen weight. She raised a hand, signaling for a ride. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window slightly, just enough to hear her voice. She spoke softly, her words tinged with desperation. "Please, I need help. My car broke down, and I don't know where I am." Her accent was unfamiliar, her voice trembling with fear. I hesitated, the warnings of countless horror stories echoing in my mind. But the loneliness of the road and the haunting emptiness of the night swayed me. I unlocked the door, and she slid into the passenger seat, her presence filling the car with an unsettling chill. As she settled in, she muttered a soft thank you, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I stole a glance at her, noting the pallor of her skin and the hollow emptiness in her eyes. Her gaze was fixed ahead, unblinking, as if she were staring into some distant, unreachable place. The silence between us was thick, oppressive, broken only by the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of her shifting in the seat. I tried to make small talk, asking her where she was headed, but she remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. The unease that had been gnawing at me intensified, a cold dread creeping up my spine. I glanced at her again, and this time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her reflection was absent from the rearview mirror. Panic surged through me, my breath quickening, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I dared not look at her directly, afraid of what I might see. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air in the car grew thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was closing in around me. I needed to get away, to escape this nightmare, but the road offered no solace, no escape. The headlights illuminated a sign ahead, its words barely visible in the dim light. As I drew closer, the words became clear. "Welcome to Hollow Creek." A chill ran through me. I had never heard of Hollow Creek, and the isolation of the area suggested it was a place best avoided. I glanced at the woman, her face still hidden beneath the hood, her presence a silent weight beside me. The unease that had been gnawing at me now blossomed into full-blown terror. I needed to get out, to leave this place, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, leading me deeper into the unknown. The woman shifted in her seat, her head turning slightly toward me, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "You're lost," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic hum that sent shivers down my spine. "But don't worry, you're not alone." Her words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken promise. I tried to speak, to ask her what she meant, but my voice failed me, caught in the grip of an unseen terror. The car seemed to slow, the engine's hum fading into an eerie silence. The darkness outside pressed in, the trees lining the road bending toward us, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, my breath misting in the air. I glanced at the woman again, her face now partially visible beneath the hood. Her features twisted into a grotesque smile that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a pull, a compulsion to look deeper, to see beyond the surface. As I did, the world around me began to distort, the road warping and twisting, the trees bending and contorting into monstrous shapes. The car lurched, the tires screeching as if they were being dragged across gravel. The woman leaned closer, her breath cold against my ear, her voice a soft whisper. "You're not alone," she repeated, her words a haunting melody that echoed in my mind. The car swerved violently, the headlights flashing erratically, casting fleeting shadows that danced and flickered like specters. The engine sputtered, the sound grinding against my eardrums, and then, with a final, deafening silence, the car came to a halt. The woman was gone. The seat beside me was empty, the air thick with the remnants of her presence. I sat frozen, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness outside pressed in, the silence deafening. I dared not move, dared not breathe, as if any action would shatter the fragile barrier between reality and nightmare. The minutes stretched into eternity, each second a weight pressing down on me. Finally, I gathered the courage to look around. The road was empty, the sign for Hollow Creek barely visible in the distance. The woman was gone, but the terror she had instilled remained, a lingering presence that refused to be shaken. I started the car, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness. But the road ahead seemed endless, the shadows stretching out like a labyrinth with no exit. I drove, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that I had to keep moving, had to escape the nightmare that had become my reality. The woman, the whispers, the terror, they were all part of the same twisted tale, a story that had no end, no resolution. I was trapped in a cycle, a loop that I couldn't escape, a passenger in my own life. It began with an innocent enough curiosity, as these things often do, on a humid summer night when the world seemed to buzz with unseen electricity, and the air itself felt alive with possibilities. I was staying at my grandmother's old house deep in the countryside, a crumbling relic of a bygone era, its warped wooden floors and peeling wallpaper breathing stories of lives long forgotten. The house was the only one for miles, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to whisper secrets to those willing, or foolish enough, to listen. My grandmother had warned me about venturing too far into the woods, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of the Black Well, a place she claimed was cursed, though she refused to elaborate further. Her vague warnings only served to pique my interest, and that night, as the clock struck midnight and the cicadas droned a hypnotic lullaby, I decided to see the well for myself. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a misplaced sense of bravado, I slipped out of the house and into the thick, oppressive darkness of the forest. The trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky, and the underbrush seemed to writhe beneath my feet as if alive. The air grew colder the deeper I ventured, and an unnatural silence settled over the woods, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the damp ground. I followed a barely discernible path that twisted and turned like a serpent, each step pulling me deeper into the unknown. Then I saw it, the well. It was an unassuming thing at first glance, a simple stone structure half hidden by overgrown weeds and moss, but as I approached, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The air around the well seemed heavier, almost suffocating, and the flashlight flickered as if protesting its proximity to the thing. The stones were slick with an unidentifiable black substance that glistened in the dim light, and the opening yawned like the mouth of some ancient, hungry beast. I should have turned back then, listened to the primal instinct screaming at me to flee, but curiosity is a cruel master. Against my better judgment, I peered into the well, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the inky blackness. What I saw or thought I saw defies explanation. The darkness within the well wasn't natural. It seemed to ripple and shift like a living thing, a pulsating void that swallowed the light and left only an aching emptiness in its wake. And then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth, calling my name with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. The sound was not of this world, a haunting melody laced with malice and despair, and it filled my mind with images of unspeakable horrors. Twisted faces screaming in agony, shadowy figures writhing in torment, a vast, desolate landscape bathed in blood-red light. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out all other thoughts. "Come closer," they urged, their tones seductive and commanding. I don't know what possessed me, whether it was some spell the whispers had cast or my own reckless curiosity, but I found myself stepping toward the well, my movements sluggish, as if wading through molasses. My hand reached out of its own accord, fingers trembling as they brushed the cold, slimy edge of the stone. The moment I touched it, the world around me seemed to shift. The forest disappeared, replaced by an endless void of darkness, and I was no longer standing but falling, plummeting into the abyss with a speed that stole the breath from my lungs. The whispers became screams, deafening and dissonant, a cacophony of voices pleading, cursing, laughing, and crying. I don't know how long I fell, minutes, hours, days, but eventually, I landed with a bone-jarring thud on a surface that felt simultaneously solid and fluid. The darkness here was absolute, but it was alive, writhing and pulsating as if the very fabric of reality was breathing. And then they came, the figures, shadowy, amorphous beings that oozed from the darkness like living tar, their forms constantly shifting, never settling on a single shape. They surrounded me, their hollow eyes burning with a malevolent light, and their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles that revealed rows of needle-like teeth. One of them stepped forward, or rather, slithered, and reached out a clawed hand that seemed to drip with the same black substance that coated the well. Its touch burned like acid, searing my flesh and filling my veins with ice. The creature leaned in close, its breath rancid and suffocating, and whispered in a voice that was both many and one. "You shouldn't have come here." I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The darkness pressed in from all sides, crushing me, suffocating me, until I was certain I would be consumed entirely. Just as I felt myself slipping away, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling again, this time faster, the screams of the shadowy beings echoing in my ears. I awoke on the forest floor, the first rays of dawn piercing through the canopy above. The well was gone, and the forest was eerily silent, as if the events of the night had been nothing more than a fevered dream. But the burns on my arm told a different story, their jagged, blackened edges pulsating faintly as if alive. I stumbled back to my grandmother's house, my mind racing with questions and fear. She was waiting for me on the porch, her expression a mixture of relief and horror when she saw the state I was in. "You went to the well," she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak, and she sighed deeply, her eyes filling with tears. "The well doesn't just take you," she whispered. "It keeps a part of you, and now it's watching." She wouldn't say more, but that night, as I lay in bed, I felt it. The weight of unseen eyes, the faint whisper of voices just beyond the edge of hearing. The well had taken something from me, but it had left something behind as well. A dark seed that took root in my soul, its tendrils spreading slowly, inexorably. And I knew with a chilling certainty that one day it would call me back. I've always been a skeptic, the kind of person who scoffs at ghost stories and dismisses the paranormal as nothing more than figments of overactive imaginations. But that was before I found the village. It started innocently enough, as all terrifying things do, with a simple map tucked away in an old bookstore, a relic of a bygone era. The map was hand-drawn, its edges worn and frayed, marked with a location far off the beaten path in the middle of nowhere, a place that didn't appear on any modern map. Couldn't resist. I had to see it for myself, armed with only my camera and the naive confidence of someone who had never experienced real fear. I set off alone one crisp autumn morning, the promise of an adventure and a story to tell beckoning me forward. The village was located deep in a forest, far from any main roads, nestled between two mountain ranges that seemed to trap the place in a permanent shadow. The air grew colder the closer I got, the trees thickening around me as if trying to keep me from reaching my destination. By the time I reached the outskirts of the village, the sun had begun to set, casting an eerie orange hue across the landscape. It was silent, unnaturally so, and the silence gnawed at my nerves. The village itself was a collection of crumbling, dilapidated houses, their windows dark and empty, the doors hanging off their hinges as if abandoned for years. The buildings were made of dark, rotting wood, their exteriors covered in creeping vines and moss, and a strange, musty smell clung to the air, like something that had been long forgotten. I wandered through the village, snapping photos, fascinated by the decay and the haunting beauty of the place. As I explored, I noticed strange markings etched into the walls of some of the houses, symbols I couldn't recognize, their meanings lost to time. In the center of the village stood a large, twisted tree, its gnarled roots spreading out in all directions, its branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. Beneath it was a stone well, old and worn, its surface slick with moisture. There was something off about the well, something unsettling that tugged at the edges of my mind, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As I approached the well, I felt a strange sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath me was shifting. My stomach churned with a deep, primal unease, but I forced myself to look down into the well, the flashlight from my camera illuminating the black void below. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving in the darkness, something large, shifting, writhing in the depths. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. I turned to leave, but as I stepped back, I heard a noise, faint but distinct, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air. I froze. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. My heart raced, my breath caught in my throat, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. I called out, my voice trembling with uncertainty, but the only response was the whisper of the wind rustling through the trees. I continued my exploration, but now the air felt heavier, as though something unseen was watching me from the shadows. As I ventured further into the village, I came across a large house at the edge of the settlement, its windows boarded up, the door barely hanging on its hinges. A thick layer of dust coated the floor inside, but there was something strange about it, something wrong. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I could sense a presence just beyond my vision, lurking in the corners of the room. The air grew colder still, and the temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I stepped deeper into the house, the floor creaking under my weight, and as I did, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. The house seemed to breathe around me, the walls creaking and groaning as if they were alive. Panic surged within me as I realized I was trapped. The darkness grew thicker, swallowing the light from my flashlight, and I fumbled desperately with the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, came from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." My blood ran cold. I backed away, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I needed to get out, but the house had become a labyrinth, the walls shifting, the corridors twisting and turning in impossible directions. I stumbled through the house, the whispering growing louder with each step, until I reached a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. I hesitated. Something deep within me screamed to turn back, but my feet moved of their own accord, carrying me down into the darkness. The air in the basement was thick and musty, the smell of decay heavy in the air. The flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, and that's when I saw it. A large old chest sitting in the far corner of the room, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. There was something about the chest that drew me in, a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. My hands trembled as I opened it, and what I found inside made my stomach turn. It was a collection of old, tattered photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. Faces of people I didn't recognize, their eyes empty and hollow, staring at me through the photographs. The longer I looked at them, the more they seemed to change, their expressions shifting, becoming twisted and grotesque. I dropped the photographs, my heart racing, but when I turned to leave, I found the door had closed behind me again. Panic flooded my chest as I realized I was trapped once more. But then, through the darkness, I heard something moving, something crawling, a soft, wet sound that made my skin crawl. I wasn't alone anymore. I backed away, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was no sign of whatever was following me. The air grew thick with an oppressive force, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. The whispering grew louder, now a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, demanding that I stay, that I never leave. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, my mind reeling. And then, as if the house itself had decided I had seen too much, the darkness rushed toward me, swallowing everything in its path. When I woke up, I was back outside, standing in front of the village, the sun now fully risen. The village was gone, the buildings had vanished, and the forest was silent once again. I looked around, disoriented and confused, but there was no sign of the house, the well, or anything I had seen. It was as if the village had never existed. My camera was gone, along with the photos I had taken, and I could not remember how I had left. But deep down, I knew the truth. The village had never really let me go. Something had followed me, something dark, something ancient, and now it was waiting for me to return. I had always considered myself a brave person, one who would never fall victim to the stories and rumors that so often swirl around small towns. And yet I would soon learn how wrong I was. It started with the house. I didn't need it, but when the opportunity to buy the old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town came up, I couldn't resist. I was looking for a fresh start, an escape from the chaos of city life, and this house promised the solitude and peace I craved. It was perfect in its decrepitude, weathered paint peeling from the wooden trim, ivy creeping up the stone facade, and a deep, almost eerie silence surrounding it. It stood isolated, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow up the house in their shadows, especially when the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was as if the house existed in its own world, separated from everything else, but I told myself that was just a coincidence, the product of my overactive imagination. The first few days were uneventful, spent unpacking and trying to breathe some life into the place, replacing broken windows, fixing the plumbing, and even starting small repairs to the grand staircase that led to the second floor. But soon, things began to feel off. At night, when the wind howled outside, I would hear faint scratching sounds coming from within the walls. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling, an old structure groaning under its own weight, but the noises persisted, growing more persistent and unnerving with each passing night. The scratching would start just after I'd turn off the lights, when everything was still, and then it would grow louder, almost as if something or someone was trying to claw its way out from behind the plaster and wood. I'd stand frozen in the dark, straining to listen, my heart racing, but by the time I turned on the lights and searched, there was never any sign of disturbance, only the oppressive silence that followed. Then the whispers started, low and guttural at first, almost like a distant conversation I couldn't quite understand. But as the days passed, the voices grew clearer, becoming louder, more urgent, and more numerous. It was as if the walls were speaking to me, urging me to listen, to heed their call. The strange thing was, the voices didn't seem to come from any particular direction. They would echo through the halls, curling around me like tendrils, brushing against my ears, never staying in one place long enough for me to pinpoint their origin. The worst part wasn't the whispers, though. It was the eyes. They appeared one evening, just as I was sitting in the living room, reading a book to try and distract myself from the growing sense of dread that had taken root in my chest. I looked up from the pages, and there they were, eyes, dozens of them, peering through the cracks in the walls. They weren't normal eyes. They were unsettlingly dark, their pupils dilated to unnatural proportions, as if staring at me from some otherworldly place. I could feel them watching me, tracking my every move, their cold gaze following me as I stood up and backed away. But when I reached for my phone to take a picture, they disappeared, gone, vanished. I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that it was just the result of too much stress and too little sleep. But that night, the eyes returned. This time, they were everywhere, poking through the edges of the door frames, peering through the cracks in the floorboards, and watching me from the ceiling. They were inescapable, surrounding me, closing in. It was as if the house itself had come alive, watching me with an insidious hunger, knowing my every thought, every fear. The nights grew worse. The whispers turned into voices that called my name, mocking me, taunting me, and when I tried to sleep, I would feel the weight of unseen hands pressing against my chest, suffocating me. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Something ancient and malevolent had settled within it. something that had been there long before I arrived. I began to research the house's history, searching through old town records and speaking to the few remaining locals who still remembered the stories. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had once belonged to a wealthy family, but they had mysteriously disappeared over 100 years ago, leaving no trace of their whereabouts. There were whispers of strange rituals, of dark forces at play, and of a curse that had been placed upon the house by the family's patriarch, a man who had dabbled in forbidden occult practices. It was said that the family had made a deal with something, some entity that promised them wealth and power in exchange for their souls. When they disappeared, it was believed that the entity had taken them, leaving the house to rot, to decay, to wait for its next victim. And that victim, it seemed, was me. The more I learned, the more I realized that the house was never meant to be lived in. It was a trap, a prison, and I was its latest prisoner. The voices grew louder, the eyes more insistent, and the presence in the house became overwhelming. It wasn't just the walls now. It was the air itself that seemed to pulse with something dark and vile. I could feel the presence of something moving behind the walls, something that was no longer content with just watching me. It was reaching out, trying to pull me in. One night, as I lay in bed, trying desperately to sleep, I heard a knock at the door. It was soft at first, like the tapping of fingers, but it grew louder, more frantic, until it was banging relentlessly against the wood. I knew I should have ignored it, that I should have stayed locked inside my room, but something compelled me to answer. I opened the door, and there, standing in the hallway, was a figure cloaked in shadows. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing in on me. I backed away, but it stepped forward, following me as I retreated. Its breath was ragged, like it was starving for something. And then, from the darkness, I heard the whisper, low, guttural, almost like a growl. "You're not supposed to leave." I ran. I don't know how I managed to escape, but somehow, I found myself outside, standing on the front lawn, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The house loomed behind me, silent once again, but I knew I could never return. The eyes, the whispers, the presence, they had followed me, and as I looked back one last time, I saw them again, those same dark eyes staring out from the cracked windows, watching me, waiting for me to come back. The house still stands, untouched, decaying in the distance, but I know it hasn't let me go. It's still waiting, still calling to me, and I fear that one day I won't be able to resist. I had never believed in the supernatural, and I certainly never thought that a simple object could change the course of a life, let alone tear it apart. But that all changed the day I found it. It wasn't something special, at least not at first glance. Just an old mirror, one of those ornate, tarnished ones you see in secondhand stores, gathering dust in forgotten corners. I didn't need a mirror. In fact, I barely ever used the one in my bathroom, but something about this one intrigued me. It was the size of a full-length mirror, and its frame was intricately carved with twisted vines and grotesque faces. Faces that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, but I chalked it up to the poor lighting and my tired eyes. I bought it on impulse. The price was ridiculously low, and when the shopkeeper noticed my interest, he smiled in a way that sent a chill down my spine, almost as if he were warning me not to buy it. But of course, I ignored it. I brought it home and set it up in the living room right next to the fireplace where it wouldn't be in the way. For a few days, it was just like any other mirror, nothing out of the ordinary. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first, shadows flickering across the glass when there was no light to cast them, fleeting figures that danced at the edge of my vision. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the angle or the dim lighting playing tricks on me. But when I started noticing things even during the day, distortions, movements that didn't belong, my skepticism began to fade. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch, I glanced at the mirror and saw something I couldn't explain. There was a figure in it. At first, I thought it was just my reflection, but then I realized it wasn't. It was someone else, a person I didn't recognize, standing in the mirror, facing away from me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I rushed to the mirror, convinced I was losing my mind, but there was no sign of anyone. The reflection was my own. I checked the mirror every day after that, half expecting to see the figure again, but it was always empty until one night it wasn't. I woke up to a sound in the middle of the night, a low whispering that seemed to come from the mirror itself. My heart raced as I turned toward it, and this time I saw the figure again, but this time it wasn't standing still. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, turning its head toward me, its face pale and twisted with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I froze, unable to look away. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as though the figure was trying to speak, but no words came. The air around me grew cold, and I could feel an intense pressure building, as though something was pushing against me from the other side. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. Slowly, the figure reached out with a hand, its fingers stretching through the glass as if it were trying to escape, trying to pull itself into my world. I backed away, but the figure's hand moved faster, and before I knew it, I was falling back onto the floor, the cold air surrounding me like a vice. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been torn open, and I was trapped inside the mirror with it, unable to move, unable to escape. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything went silent. The figure disappeared, the whispers faded, and the mirror was empty once more. I lay there, trembling, my mind reeling, unsure of what had just happened. I told myself it was just a bad dream, that it was all in my head, but the feeling of coldness lingered. I could still feel the figure's presence, still feel its eyes on me, as if it were watching me from the other side of the glass. From that day on, things got worse. I began to see more figures in the mirror, some familiar, some completely unknown. They would appear when I least expected it, standing in the background of my reflection, their faces twisted in pain or rage. They would reach out toward me, their hands scraping against the glass, leaving marks that couldn't be wiped away. I tried everything to get rid of it, the mirror, I tried to burn it, but the flames wouldn't touch it. I tried throwing it out, but it always came back. No matter what I did, the mirror was always there, and so were the figures. The worst part was that the figures began to change. They started to look more like me, but twisted and contorted into grotesque versions of myself. I'd see them in the mirror, standing there with wide, empty eyes, their faces distorted in expressions of terror or agony. It was as if the mirror was showing me a version of myself that I couldn't escape, a version that was slowly consuming me from the inside out. I stopped looking into it, stopped facing it altogether, but no matter how much I tried to avoid it, the mirror would always find a way to make itself known. It would reflect things I didn't want to see, places I didn't want to go, and people I didn't want to face. But what truly terrified me was the night I looked into the mirror and saw something that wasn't just a reflection. There, behind me, standing in the shadows of the room, was another figure. This one wasn't in the mirror. It was real. I turned around in a panic, but no one was there. I turned back to the mirror and it was gone. I didn't know if it had been there all along, if it had been waiting for me to look, or if the mirror had somehow summoned it. But the one thing I knew for sure was that it had followed me. I began to hear it at night, the footsteps behind me, the sound of breathing in my ear when no one was there. And when I looked into the mirror, I could see its shadow, always just behind me, always just out of sight, waiting for the moment I would slip up and let it take me. It's been months now, and I can't escape it. The figure is still there, lurking in the reflection, and the whispers have only gotten louder. They don't just come from the mirror anymore, they come from everywhere. They're inside my head. The mirror is no longer a mere object. It's a doorway, a portal, and I fear that soon it will pull me in, that I'll be trapped in there forever with the figures, with the darkness, with whatever it is that's waiting for me on the other side. And as I sit here, writing this, I can feel the cold breath on the back of my neck, the whisper in my ear. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I don't know if I can keep running from it, or if one day the mirror will take me, and I'll become just another face, staring out from behind the glass, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of looking. It all started when I moved into that old apartment on 3rd Street. The place was cheap, a bit run down, but the price was right, and I needed a place to crash after my breakup. The landlord was strange, barely speaking when we met, just a nod and a key. But it didn't matter. I just needed to forget. The apartment itself wasn't much to look at. Small, 1-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. The walls were thin, and the faint sounds of the city echoed from the alleyway below. It had a cold, stale smell that I couldn't quite get rid of, no matter how many candles I burned. But something about it felt familiar, like I had been there before. The first few nights were uneventful. I went to bed early, slept in late, trying to escape the exhaustion from my broken heart. But soon, I began hearing things, soft, almost imperceptible sounds coming from the room next to mine. At first, I dismissed it as the building settling, the pipes, or maybe just my imagination running wild. But the noises didn't stop. They came at night, every night, like clockwork, scratching, dragging, whispering. Sometimes, I'd hear faint footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth in that room. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to old, creaky buildings and my overactive mind, but it became impossible to sleep. One night, I finally got up to check. I thought maybe it was rats or something, but when I peeked inside the room next to mine, the room I hadn't even bothered to use, it was empty. The bed was made, the curtains pulled shut, nothing out of the ordinary, except for the mirror on the wall. I hadn't noticed it before. It was large, framed in dark wood, its surface cloudy and streaked with something that looked like fingerprints. I thought it was odd, but I didn't pay much attention to it. The whispers started again that night, louder this time and more insistent. The footsteps, the dragging sound. It was all so real, so close. I stayed in bed, clutching my pillow, telling myself it was just the wind or some old pipes acting up. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't until I noticed the mirror that things really started to spiral. Every time I looked into it, I saw something different, something out of place. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of the reflection, a dark shape that wasn't mine. I thought I was imagining it, but as the days passed, the shadows grew. They started moving. I could see them shifting in the glass, right behind me, as if someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. I tried to cover the mirror, but no matter what I did, the reflection never stopped moving. The next night, I was lying in bed when I heard a loud bang coming from the room next door. I jumped up, heart racing, and ran over to check. This time, the door was open. I could see the mirror clearly now, and I swear to God, I saw a figure standing in it. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, with a face I couldn't make out. It was like staring into a void, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me to approach. I backed away, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, and the longer I stared at it, the more it felt like it was pulling me in. The whispers returned, louder this time, and with them, a horrible, oppressive sense of dread that filled the room. I turned and ran. I didn't even think. I just had to get out of there. But when I reached the hallway, something was wrong. The hallway was longer than it had been before. The walls seemed to stretch, and the air felt thicker, heavier, like something was suffocating me. I tried to turn back, but the door to my apartment was gone. Instead, I was standing in front of a different door, one I didn't recognize, one I couldn't explain. And when I opened it, I found myself in the room with the mirror. The mirror, I didn't know how, but there it was, still reflecting the figure, still showing me things I didn't understand. The figure stepped closer in the reflection, its hand moving toward the glass, its fingers reaching out, as if it were trying to grab me. I could feel the cold air around it, the unnatural chill that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. I turned to run again, but the hallway had changed again. It was gone. The door to my apartment was nowhere to be seen. I was trapped. I knew I was trapped. The figure was in the mirror, but it was also in the room with me, growing closer, its presence suffocating. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were voices, speaking in tongues, and I could feel their words crawling inside my mind, making my thoughts spiral, making me question what was real. It was too much. Couldn't take it. Couldn't breathe. The figure was almost touching the glass now, its face distorted, the shadow of its hand pushing against the surface of the mirror as though it were about to step through. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I tried to run, but I was frozen in place. The mirror was everything now. It had consumed the room, the apartment, the hallway. I could no longer tell where the reflection ended and where reality began. And then, the figure's hand slipped through the glass. The moment it touched my skin, everything went black. I woke up hours later, lying on the floor in front of the mirror, my head pounding. The room was quiet again, the air still, but the mirror, God, the mirror was different. The figure was gone, but something was there. Something that wasn't supposed to be. It wasn't me. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it was staring back at me. It was smiling, and as I reached up to touch my face, I realized I was still standing in front of the mirror. It was me, but not me. I had become the figure. I had become the thing that lived in the reflection. And I knew, deep down, that there was no escape now. I was trapped, both in the mirror and in the room. And I would never leave. Not alive. Not whole. And maybe that's why, every time someone moves into the apartment on 3rd Street, they end up finding that mirror. And the cycle starts again. It was the kind of night that felt wrong the second I stepped outside. The air had this heavy, unnatural chill to it, even though the forecast had predicted warmth. The streets were strangely empty for a Friday night, and the only sound that accompanied my steps was the echo of my own shoes against the wet pavement. I had missed the last bus, so I had no choice but to walk the mile to the station. But there was something off about the whole night. The moon hung low in the sky, a sickly yellow, casting distorted shadows that seemed to shift with every passing second. The streetlights flickered like they were struggling to stay on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I glanced around, my breath visible in the air, even though it wasn't cold enough to warrant it. When I reached the train station, it was completely empty. No ticket vendor, no commuters, nothing. The only sound was the distant hum of the tracks, vibrating through the ground like a warning. I figured the train would be there soon, so I waited. As I sat on the old, cracked bench, I noticed the ticket machine was out of order, the screen flickering erratically. It almost looked like it was trying to display something, but the words were all scrambled, like some kind of broken code. I felt a strange sense of unease settle in my chest as I stared at it, but I pushed it aside. I checked my watch, 2:15 a.m. The train should be here any minute. But when the first train finally appeared on the tracks, it didn't look right. It was old, way older than the ones that usually ran this line. The headlights were dim, and the body of the train was rusted, its once pristine surface now streaked with grime and time. The doors slid open, and I hesitated for just a moment, but my tired body urged me forward. It had been a long day, and I just wanted to get home. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a shift, like I was no longer in the real world. The air inside the train was stifling, and the seats were covered in dust, as if no one had ridden it in years. The only sound inside was the creaking of the train, like it was groaning under its own weight. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just an old train, maybe even out of service. But as the train doors closed behind me, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of isolation. The train began to move slowly at first, but then it picked up speed. I looked out the window, expecting to see the familiar sights of the city, but there was nothing. No lights, no buildings, no streets, just darkness stretching on forever, like the world had disappeared. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal, no service at all. I was completely cut off. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked down the aisle, hoping to find someone, anyone, to reassure me that this was normal. But the train was empty, completely empty. Not a single passenger, no conductor, just silence. My footsteps echoed loudly as I moved through the train, trying every door to see if any of the cars were occupied. All were locked. I felt my stomach churn as panic began to rise. The train was moving faster now, way faster than it should have, but there was no sign of slowing down. I tried the emergency brake, but the lever wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the train into an impenetrable darkness. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, the only sound now the rhythmic clattering of the train wheels on the tracks. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, like someone was speaking just behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I could feel their presence, though, like they were watching me from the shadows. Another whisper, this one louder, and I felt it crawl down my spine. I ran back to the front of the train, but the door was still locked, and as I rattled the handle, the whispering grew into a low growl, like something was trying to claw its way out from the darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed through the door to the conductor's cabin, but it was empty, just a dark, hollow room. The train was moving so fast now that I felt my vision blur. The walls were warping, bending, like the train was no longer following the tracks. It was twisting, bending, stretching through some otherworldly place, and I could feel the walls pressing in on me, suffocating me. The growling grew louder, closer, and then the lights flickered back on. But when I looked at the reflection in the window, I saw something that wasn't me. A pale, twisted version of myself, with hollow eyes and a smile that stretched too far across its face. I backed away, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning at me, its eyes wide and unblinking. It was in the glass, but also somehow inside the train, inside my mind. It started to speak, its voice like gravel scraping against metal, whispering my name over and over again, until it was a deafening scream. I tried to run, but the train was no longer moving. It had stopped, and the doors to the outside world were sealed shut. I could feel something in the darkness, something watching me, something waiting. And then, as if by some twisted fate, the train doors opened. I don't remember how I got out. I don't know where I was, or if I was still even on Earth. The world around me was nothing but endless blackness. like the train had transported me to another dimension, another reality. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was completely alone, surrounded by nothing but the dark. The train had taken me to nowhere, and there was no way out. I'm still here. I don't know how long it's been since I last saw a person, a sign of life, but I'm trapped. And if you ever find yourself on that train, at the same station I was, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The last train to nowhere doesn't just take you anywhere. It takes you to a place where time and space don't exist, where you're just a lost soul waiting for the next passenger to board. And when you do, you'll become a part of the story, a part of the train's endless journey. You'll never leave. You'll never wake up. You'll never escape. I had always been a skeptic, a firm believer that the eerie stories my grandmother used to tell me were nothing but childish fantasies. You know, the type of ghost stories that are supposed to send shivers down your spine but are so absurd that you can't help but laugh. But that all changed the day I found the mirror under the floorboards. It happened when I moved into the old house I had inherited from my late aunt, a place I never knew existed until I was handed the keys. It was a large, creaky Victorian house, filled with dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and mothballs, and the walls seemed to groan with the weight of forgotten memories. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt something in the air shift. It wasn't just the eeriness of the house. It was like something was waiting. But that didn't stop me. I had no choice but to stay there. The house had been in the family for generations. The first few nights were uneventful. I went about cleaning the place up, ignoring the whispers of the house's past, convinced that they were nothing more than my imagination running wild. But then, on the fourth day, something strange happened. I was in the attic, rummaging through old boxes, when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the floor below me. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then it came again, closer, more insistent. My curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way downstairs, following the sound until I reached the living room. There, in the corner of the room, hidden beneath a thick layer of dust, was an old wooden chest. It wasn't like any chest I had ever seen before. This one was intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light, as though they were alive. As I approached it, the tapping stopped. The house was silent again, save for the creaks of the old floorboards beneath my feet. I opened the chest, half expecting to find some forgotten trinket, but instead, I found something much more terrifying: a mirror. It was small, but it radiated a presence that made my skin crawl. The glass was cracked, and the frame was covered in strange carvings, almost like an ancient language that seemed to pulse with energy. Without thinking, I reached out and touched it. The moment my fingers made contact with the cold surface, a jolt ran through my body, like 1,000 volts of electricity. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I felt something deep within me stir, something old, something ancient, like the mirror had awoken a force that had been lying dormant for centuries. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a fluke, but when I looked back at the mirror, I saw something in the reflection that made my blood run cold. It wasn't me. At least, it wasn't my reflection. The figure that stared back at me was a twisted, contorted version of myself, its eyes wide and hollow, its smile stretching unnaturally across its face. It seemed to mock me, as if it knew something I didn't. I turned away, trying to shake off the horror that gripped my chest. But when I looked back again, it was gone. Just an empty mirror. I thought I was losing my mind. I left the attic that night and locked the chest away, but the next few days brought more strange occurrences. Every time I looked into any reflective surface, I saw that same figure. The twisted version of me, lurking in the background, its eyes following me, waiting. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left. The worst part was the sound, the tapping, started again. Soft at first, like distant footsteps, but gradually it grew louder until it was a frantic pounding, as if something was trying to break through the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it was always there, just out of reach. I even tried covering the mirrors, but no matter what I did, I could still hear the tapping, growing more insistent, more urgent, like it was calling me. Then, one night, I heard it clearly. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. I couldn't stop myself from going down to the basement, though every step I took felt heavier than the last. The moment I descended into the dark, damp basement, the air grew thick with dread. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the tapping was now joined by a low, guttural growl, like something was slithering just beneath the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the corner of the basement where the floorboards were loose. I knelt down and pried one up with trembling hands. What I found underneath was worse than I could have ever imagined. A small, rectangular space, just big enough for the mirror. I don't know why I did it, but I placed the mirror in the opening, and the moment I did, the growl stopped. The house grew eerily quiet, and I felt an oppressive weight lift from my chest. But then the tapping resumed, closer, faster, like it was now right behind me. I turned, and there it was, the twisted reflection of myself, standing at the top of the stairs, smiling that grotesque, impossible smile. Its eyes were black, bottomless pits, and it was moving toward me, inch by inch, as if it had all the time in the world. I ran up the stairs, my breath ragged, my legs burning, but every time I looked back, it was closer. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, that thing was always right behind me. I could feel its presence creeping closer, until finally, I reached the attic. I grabbed the chest, the mirror still inside, and ran back down to the basement. But when I opened the chest, the mirror was gone. The tapping stopped. The house grew quiet again, but I could still feel it, deep inside me, like it had never left. I could feel it whispering to me, calling me back to the mirror beneath the floorboards. The worst part, I couldn't remember if I had ever left. Was I still in the house, or was the house now inside me? I don't know anymore. All I know is that I'll never escape. That mirror, whatever it was, has me now, and it's waiting for the next person to fall into its grasp. Just waiting for you. I've always been haunted by the strange events that happened that summer. The summer I found him, or rather, the summer he found me. It was an ordinary afternoon when I stumbled across the old house at the edge of the woods. My friends had warned me not to go near it, claiming it was cursed, but I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I was never one to indulge in superstitions or ghost stories. But that house, there was something about it, something that drew me in like a magnet. The house itself was abandoned, or so I thought. I remember standing in front of the wrought iron gate, which was overgrown with ivy, the once white paint now peeling and faded. There were no signs of life, no indication that anyone had been there for years. Yet, I felt a strange pull, a whispering in the back of my mind urging me to enter. I had heard stories from the locals about the house, about the child who had lived there. An odd, reclusive boy who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago. They said he had been a lonely child, always kept indoors by his overprotective mother, who was said to have been a bit strange herself. Some even said the boy had never truly been alive, that he was a creation of his mother's delusions. But I didn't believe in any of that. I was just looking for an adventure. What harm could come from exploring an abandoned house, after all? So, I pushed open the rusted gate and walked up the crooked path toward the front door. The wood creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered in every corner. The floors groaned beneath my feet, as though they, too, were weary of the house's forgotten past. As I walked through the darkened hallway, I noticed the walls were lined with faded photographs. Images of a woman who appeared to be the child's mother, but the boy was never in any of them. I couldn't help but feel a cold chill crawl up my spine as I moved deeper into the house, my breath becoming shallow with every step I took. Then, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a soft tapping, like the gentle knock of knuckles against wood. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from upstairs. Something in me stirred, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Curiosity won over caution, and I found myself slowly making my way up the creaking staircase. Each step was like a loud, accusing echo in the silence, until I finally reached the top. The air up here was colder, and the light from the outside barely penetrated the dusty windows. The tapping was now joined by another sound, one that chilled me to the core, a child's laughter. The kind of laughter that should never come from an empty house, the kind of laughter that makes your skin crawl. I followed the sound to the farthest room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw him. A small boy, no older than 6, sitting in the corner of the room. His back was to me, and he was holding something in his hands. I didn't know why, but I was drawn to him. I stepped closer, slowly, trying not to make a sound, but the floorboards betrayed me, creaking under my weight. The boy turned around, and I froze. His face was pale, too pale, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. His lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was a grin so wide, so unnatural, it made my stomach churn. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice a strange mix of childlike innocence and something far darker. I took a step back, heart racing, but my body refused to obey. "I've been waiting for you," he continued, his smile never wavering. His hands, which I now noticed were covered in something dark and sticky, reached out to me. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, his voice growing more forceful, more demanding. And then the room seemed to warp. The walls stretched, the ceiling bent, and the floor tilted, like the very foundation of the house was shifting. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, as though something invisible was choking me. The boy stood up, and I saw for the first time what he was holding. It was a doll, an old, tattered thing, its eyes sewn shut, its mouth frozen in a permanent scream. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it looked exactly like me. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest, but the boy advanced toward me, his footsteps slow but certain. "You can't leave," he said, his voice now full of venom. "You've already crossed the line. Now you're mine." I turned and ran, but the house seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in, the doorways shifting like some twisted labyrinth. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, the boy was always there, his laughter echoing through the house like a chorus of madness. I didn't know how long I ran, hours, maybe days, but I could never find the door. The windows were covered in layers of dust, and no matter how hard I tried to break them, they wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I was never meant to leave. I still don't know how I escaped. I woke up one morning, lying on the cold floor of the house, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew something had changed. The boy wasn't gone. He never was. His presence lingered, like a shadow I could never outrun. And when I closed my eyes at night, I would hear that laughter again, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. I never went back to the house, but sometimes, when I walk through the woods, I feel it, his eyes on me, watching, waiting. I can never escape him, not really. He's still out there in that house, and he's still waiting for the next person to come through the gate. So if you ever find yourself at the edge of the woods, standing in front of an old, abandoned house, I beg you, turn around. Don't go in, because once you do, you'll never leave. Not for real. And the boy, he'll be waiting, always. Started out like any other night. I had just finished my shift at work, the streets were quiet, and the city's hum of distant traffic was the only sound keeping me company. I decided to take my usual route home, a shortcut through a narrow alley that ran parallel to a row of old, decaying houses. There was something oddly comforting about it, a sense of familiarity that made it feel like my personal passageway, untouched by the world outside. But tonight was different. Tonight, something felt off from the moment I stepped into the alley. At first, it was subtle, just a slight unease, like I wasn't alone, but I shrugged it off. The usual noises were gone. The rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant voices of people chatting on their balconies, even the faint screech of an old car speeding down the street. All were silent. I walked faster, trying to shake off the strange feeling crawling up my spine, but the quicker I went, the more the sensation grew. I could hear footsteps behind me, faint but distinct, as if someone was walking just out of sight, mirroring my every move. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the alley behind me was empty. No one was there, yet the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, soft but insistent, like they were drawing closer with each step I took. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. My breathing grew shallow, and my skin prickled as I quickened my pace. The footsteps kept pace with me, always a few paces behind, never faltering. I broke into a jog, my legs aching from the effort, but no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps stayed with me. That's when I noticed something even worse, something that made my stomach churn with terror. The sound of my own footsteps had disappeared. It was as though the alley itself was swallowing up the sound, leaving only the ever-present echo of the invisible stalker behind me. My pulse thudded in my ears as I glanced over my shoulder again. There was nothing but the dark, empty alley stretching out behind me. But then I saw it, a shadow, barely perceptible in the dim light, moving just out of sight, barely visible from the corner of my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart racing, as I watched the shadow shift, elongate, and take form. It was a figure, a man tall and thin, his features obscured by the darkness. He was standing just a few feet away, barely visible, as if he had been there the whole time, just waiting. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a sudden chill run through me, like icy fingers brushing against my skin. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. He simply stood there, watching me, his presence suffocating. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. No movement, no sound, just gone. But the footsteps, they continued. Only now they were ahead of me. I didn't even think. I just ran. My legs felt like lead, my chest tightening with each breath. But I pushed forward, desperation fueling my every step. The alley stretched on longer than I remembered, as if the walls were closing in around me, narrowing with each passing moment. Every time I turned a corner, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker, and more oppressive. The footsteps didn't stop. They were right behind me again, following me like a predator stalking its prey. I dared not look back this time. My only focus was getting out. As I rounded the final bend, I saw the exit to the alley, freedom, or so I thought. The streetlights at the end beckoned me like a lighthouse in a storm, promising safety. But just as I reached the mouth of the alley, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, a grasp so strong, so unyielding, that it made my skin burn where it touched me. I screamed, my voice echoing in the empty street, but the grip tightened, pulling me back. I spun around, ready to fight, but there was no one there. Just empty air, just the oppressive darkness surrounding me. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest, as I staggered away from the alley, my body trembling with fear. I looked over my shoulder one last time. The alley was still there, silent and empty, but I knew something had changed. Something had followed me home. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. I'd hear the footsteps again, faint, always just behind me, but no one was ever there. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I could never quite bring myself to look. And then, one night, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the alley behind my house. But when I looked out the window, there was no one there, just darkness. The footsteps didn't stop. They never stopped. It was like they were waiting for me to come back, waiting for me to walk down that alley again. Every time I stepped outside, every time I passed the alley, I felt the same cold grip of fear wrap around me, squeezing tighter with every step I took. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape him. Whoever he was, whatever he was still out there, and I knew he would never stop following me. It was the kind of house that no one talked about, but everyone knew about. Tucked away at the end of a street no one dared to visit, sat a grand, crumbling mansion that had been empty for as long as I could remember. People said it was haunted, cursed, and perhaps there was a truth to their words. As a child, I'd heard the rumors, listened to the stories whispered in hushed voices at school and around campfires. How the family that once lived there had vanished without a trace, leaving only a decaying shell behind. Over the years, curiosity gnawed at me. I found myself staring at it from afar, wondering what it would be like to see inside. I'd heard the strange sounds, the flickers of lights in the attic at odd hours of the night, but I'd never ventured close, too afraid of what might be waiting for me, until that one fateful day. I was walking home from work when I saw the gate slightly ajar, an invitation I couldn't ignore. It was late, the sun setting in the distance, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. Something in my gut told me it wasn't safe, but I pushed the feeling aside. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, and the rusty hinges screamed in protest. I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The once beautiful garden now nothing more than a tangle of dead vines and weeds. The house loomed ahead, towering above me like a forgotten titan. Its windows were dark, its walls cracked and weathered, but still, there was an allure to it, a pull that I couldn't resist. As I walked closer, my heart started to race, but my feet wouldn't stop moving. I reached the front door and noticed something strange. There was a faint glow coming from the crack beneath it, as if someone was inside. I hesitated. The logical part of me screamed to turn around, to leave and never look back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. It groaned as it gave way, revealing the dim, musty interior. The floor was covered in layers of dust, broken furniture scattered across the rooms, and walls that seemed to sag under the weight of time. But what caught my attention immediately was the sound. Soft, almost inaudible at first, but growing louder the longer I stood there. A slow, rhythmic tapping. My heart pounded as I stepped further into the house, my eyes darting around in search of the source of the noise. came from upstairs. Without thinking, I began to ascend the staircase, each step creaking under my weight, the sound of the tapping growing louder with every movement. The air grew colder as I climbed higher, my breath fogging up in front of me. As I reached the top of the stairs, the noise stopped. Complete silence. I stood still, trying to steady my breath, my nerves strung tight like a bow. And then I saw it. A door at the end of the hall, ajar with a faint light spilling out from the crack. I didn't know why, but I walked toward it, my legs moving on their own. As I got closer, I could see that the light wasn't normal. It flickered, like the dying glow of a candle, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. When I reached the door, I pushed it open. The room inside was small, its walls lined with shelves and old, tattered books. In the center of the room stood a single chair, facing the wall. A man was sitting in it, his back to me. He didn't move when I entered. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I stepped forward, my curiosity getting the better of me. But as soon as I did, the door slammed shut behind me. The man in the chair slowly turned, his face hidden in the shadows. When he spoke, his voice was soft, barely a whisper. "I've been waiting for you." My blood ran cold. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, a sickly yellow hue that seemed to pierce right through me. He didn't move, but his gaze locked onto mine, and I felt a chill spread through my body. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice barely audible. "You shouldn't have come to the house. It wants you. It always wants more." The room seemed to close in on me, the air thickening, suffocating. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The walls seemed to stretch, the shadows growing darker, and the tapping noise began again. Only now it was louder, closer. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was nothing. The man in the chair stood up slowly, his movements unnaturally stiff, as if he were some sort of marionette controlled by unseen strings. His hand reached out toward me, and I recoiled, but it was too late. His fingers brushed against my skin, and a searing pain shot through my body, as if his touch had burned me from the inside. I screamed, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. "You're part of it now," he whispered, his voice a sickening lullaby. The room spun around me, and the shadows seemed to reach out, wrapping around me, pulling me into the darkness. I felt my body weaken, my thoughts cloud over. The man's face twisted into a grotesque smile, his eyes glowing brighter, filling the room with an otherworldly light. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was outside the house, lying in the overgrown yard. The mansion stood in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless once again. I couldn't remember how I got out, but the sensation of that cold touch still lingered on my skin. I stumbled to my feet, shaking, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. The house was gone, vanished. There was no sign of it, no trace of its existence. It was as if it had never been there at all. I turned and walked away, my legs weak beneath me. But as I looked back, I saw something in the distance, something standing in the window of a house that no longer existed. It was him, the man in the chair. He was still waiting, still watching, and I knew with an icy certainty that I had never truly left. The house would always be there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next person to stumble in. And I, like so many others before me, would be just another lost soul, trapped within its hollow walls. I don't remember exactly when it started, but I know it's been years now. The feeling has always been there, creeping, lurking, just beyond the edges of my vision, like a presence that never left, always watching. It began when I moved to a small, secluded cabin deep in the forest. I was looking for peace, for solitude away from the chaos of city life, and I found it in that place. The cabin was old, with creaky wooden floors and ivy creeping up its sides. There was a sense of history to it, like it had been there far longer than anyone could remember. First, it was perfect. The silence was a relief. I'd wake up to the smell of pine trees and the chirping of birds. My only company, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, as time passed, the woods started to feel different. It wasn't that the forest was particularly ominous. It just felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. At night, the wind would whisper through the trees, but it wasn't like any breeze I'd heard before. There were voices in it, faint murmurs that seemed to come from far away or from all around me at once. Sometimes, in the distance, I'd hear footsteps, heavy, dragging, like someone was walking through the woods, but when I looked out the window, no one was there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the feeling grew stronger. It was one night that everything changed. I had just finished dinner and was sitting by the fire, the cabin dimly lit by the flickering flames. The wind had picked up again, but this time, the whispers sounded different, closer, more urgent. A chill ran down my spine as I stared into the fire, trying to ignore it, but the feeling of eyes on me was overwhelming. I stood up, my heart racing, and went to the window. There was nothing but darkness, just the silhouettes of the trees swaying in the wind. But then, something moved in the corner of my eye. Something wasn't right. I stepped back from the window and grabbed my flashlight, slowly making my way outside. The night air was thick, like it was pressing in on me, and the darkness seemed to have weight to it, heavy and suffocating. I shined the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the blackness, illuminating the trees and the underbrush. That's when I saw them. Dozens of them. They were everywhere, glowing faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light of the flashlight like they were watching me, waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly, trying to see where they were coming from. The eyes blinked in unison, like a mass of them, all focused on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed by the terror of being hunted, of being prey in a forest that seemed to know me, that seemed to want me. I thought I saw shapes moving in the trees, shadows that didn't quite belong to the branches they clung to. And then, I heard it, the sound of something massive shifting behind me. I spun around, my flashlight darting toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the endless, dark woods. But the eyes, they were still there, watching, unblinking. I ran. My feet pounded against the earth, the forest floor uneven beneath me, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I didn't know what was chasing me, but I knew it wasn't human. The wind howled around me, the trees groaning and creaking as if they were alive, the shadows seeming to stretch and bend with every step I took. The eyes followed, always just out of reach, but closer with every passing second. I don't remember how long I ran, only that I finally made it back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My chest was heaving, my body shaking, and I collapsed against the wall. The night was silent again, but I knew I hadn't escaped. I knew they were still out there, waiting for me to make another move. And so I sat, alone, in the dark, the only sound the pounding of my own heart. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the fear had gotten to me, and I'd imagined the eyes, the movement in the trees, the strange whispers in the wind. But deep down, I knew better. I knew the forest wasn't like any place I'd ever been. It wasn't just alive, it was aware. It had a will of its own, and it was waiting for me to slip up. I thought about leaving, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the thought that I'd never be able to outrun whatever it was that lived in those woods, or maybe it was the feeling of being trapped. So I stayed, but the whispers grew louder. The eyes were always there, lurking just beyond the reach of the light, never giving up, never letting me forget. Days passed in a blur of fear and sleepless nights. I began to lose track of time. I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming anymore. I'd hear footsteps outside the cabin at night, soft and slow, but when I'd look, no one would be there. But the eyes were there. They never left. Sometimes, when I ventured into the woods during the day, I'd catch glimpses of things watching me from between the trees, shapes that weren't quite human, their limbs twisted and unnatural, their faces hidden in the shadows. I could never see them clearly, but I knew they were real. I knew they were waiting for me to come closer. And then one night it happened. I was sitting in the cabin, staring into the fire again, when the door slowly creaked open. I didn't hear it at first. I thought it was just the wind. But then I saw it. Something moving in the doorway, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I stood up, heart pounding, my breath coming in quick gasps. And that's when I heard it. A voice, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have stayed." I looked toward the door, but no one was there. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift, the air thick with a presence that wasn't mine. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I could hear them now, voices, dozens of them all around me. The eyes had come inside. The last thing I remember is the soft rustling of leaves outside the window, the whispering wind, and the cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. Then, nothing. The forest still calls to me. I hear the whispers in the wind, feel the eyes watching me, always. I try to run, but the forest knows where I am. It knows me, and I will never escape. Not as long as the eyes are there, watching, waiting, forever. It was the night I first saw it, the mansion that shouldn't have been there. It was on the outskirts of a small, quiet town where I'd moved for a fresh start, hoping the isolation would bring peace to my tortured mind. The town was the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the most exciting thing that ever happened was a dog getting loose or a local farmer's tractor breaking down. Nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary, until that night. It was a heavy, oppressive evening, the kind where the air seems thick with the promise of rain but never delivers. I had been wandering around the town, trying to shake off the anxiety that had been gripping me for days. The streets were silent, the streetlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement, and the wind felt strangely still, as if the entire town was holding its breath. I took a turn down an alleyway, one I hadn't noticed before, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the longer I stared, the more real it became. There, hidden behind a thick veil of overgrown ivy and neglected trees, stood a massive mansion, imposing, dark, and ancient. It was unlike any house I had ever seen. The architecture was old-fashioned, but in a way that didn't belong to this time or place. The windows were black, like the pupils of an unblinking eye, and the door was a deep shade of crimson, as if it had been painted with something that wasn't quite paint. The more I looked at it, the more I felt a pull, an overwhelming urge to approach, to discover what was hidden within its walls. Despite the instinctual warning in the back of my mind, I crossed the broken stone path that led up to the mansion and pushed open the door. It creaked like a groan from the bowels of the earth, and the air inside was thick with dust and decay. The hallway stretched out in front of me, an endless corridor of dark wood and faded wallpaper that seemed to whisper in the dim light. The house was dead silent, yet I could hear something, a faint scratching, like nails against wood, coming from deep within the house. It seemed to follow me, getting louder with every step I took. I should have turned back, I knew that, but my feet were moving of their own accord, carrying me further into the mansion's heart, until I reached the grand staircase. The stairs spiraled upwards into an endless darkness, the railing cold to the touch, as though it had never been touched by human hands in decades. I hesitated for a moment, looking back at the door I had come through, but it was already closed. Locked, perhaps. I had no choice but to go up. As I climbed, I could hear the sounds of creaking floorboards above me. It was as though someone or something was moving around, pacing, waiting. I reached the top and stepped into a long hallway, the walls lined with portraits of people whose faces were twisted in grotesque expressions. Their eyes followed me as I moved past them, and the air grew colder with every step. At the far end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar, and I felt my heart pound in my chest as I made my way toward it. The scratching noises grew louder, almost as though something was clawing at the walls behind me. I reached for the handle and pushed the door open, revealing a room that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were covered in old, cracked mirrors, each reflecting a version of myself that seemed just a little off. My reflection moved in strange ways, its eyes twitching, its mouth pulling into a smile that wasn't my own. I stepped inside, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. But as soon as the door closed behind me, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The room grew colder, the mirrors darkening as though they were absorbing the light. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, something emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles, the fingers stretching out like elongated claws. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and piercing. I tried to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't budge. I was frozen, trapped in the room with it. The scratching noises were now all around me, deafening, coming from every mirror, every corner of the room. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing, pulsating with some unholy force. And then it spoke. Its voice was deep, resonating through my very bones, sending a chill through my entire body. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, the words like a caress. "But now that you're here, you'll never leave." The room seemed to warp around me, the mirrors reflecting not just my own image but countless others. People who had come before me, all trapped in this place, all caught in the mirrors. I could see their faces twisted in agony, their hands pressed against the glass, begging for release. But there was no escape. As I reached out, I could feel the coldness of the glass, and something began to claw at my soul, pulling me towards it. The figure stepped forward, its face coming into the light, and what I saw was beyond human comprehension. It wasn't a face at all, but a mass of shifting shapes, like 1,000 tortured souls, each one screaming in silent agony. The eyes, there were so many eyes, each one staring at me, pulling me deeper into the void. I struggled, I screamed, but no sound came from my mouth. The figure reached out, its hands stretching impossibly long, and I felt its cold fingers wrap around my wrist. It was the last thing I felt before everything went dark. When I woke, I was back outside, standing in front of the mansion. But it wasn't the same mansion I had entered. The door was gone, the windows shattered, and the whole place seemed to have crumbled into dust. It was as though it had never existed. I thought I had escaped. I thought it was over. But as I looked at my reflection in a shattered piece of glass from the broken windows, I realized something horrifying. My eyes were no longer my own. I could see them, the faces, the tortured souls trapped in the mirrors. They were inside me now, and they would never let me go. Every night since then, I hear the scratching. Every night, I feel them clawing at my skin, trying to break free. And I know, deep down, that I am no longer in control. The mansion is still there, hidden in the shadows of my mind, waiting for me to return. And when I do, I won't be leaving again. I never believed in the supernatural, not really. I thought all the ghost stories were just that, stories, myths meant to keep people on their toes. That was until I moved into the old apartment on Willow Street. The place was cheap, too cheap to pass up. I thought it was a steal, honestly. The landlord was an old man, gruff and a little too quiet, but that was fine with me. I liked my privacy. I had just gone through a rough breakup, and moving to a new place in a new town seemed like the perfect way to start over. First, everything seemed normal. The walls were cracked and stained, the floors creaked underfoot, and the heating system was unreliable at best, but it was manageable. I didn't mind the odd noise here and there. Old houses make sounds, right? I should have left the moment I heard the first call. It came around 2:30 a.m. as I was getting ready to fall asleep. The phone rang, loud and insistent, slicing through the silence of my empty apartment. The thing is, I didn't own a landline. The only phone I had was my cell, and it was next to me on the bed, silent. So, I had no idea where the call was coming from. My first thought was that it must have been some kind of prank, maybe a wrong number or a telemarketer, so I ignored it. But the calls came again, and again, every night at exactly 2:30 a.m. The first few times, I just chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe the neighbors had a weird alarm, but then I started to notice something strange. Each time the phone rang, I'd get this feeling, an overwhelming sense of dread that settled in my chest, making my heart race and my skin crawl. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. And when it did, I would get up, check the apartment to make sure I wasn't imagining it, but nothing ever seemed out of place. The thing that really started to scare me, though, was that no one ever spoke when I answered the phone. It wasn't a prank call or even a wrong number. It was just dead silence. And not the normal kind of silence, the kind you expect when there's no one on the other end. This silence felt alive, like it was pressing against my ears, suffocating me, filling the room with a heavy, unnatural stillness that made my skin break out in a cold sweat. As the days went by, it only got worse. The calls kept coming, each one more frequent, each one lingering longer, until I couldn't even bring myself to answer the phone anymore. But that didn't stop the calls. Now, they would ring even when I wasn't near the phone. I'd hear it echoing through the walls, reverberating through the floorboards, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside the building, from the very foundation of the place. There were nights I would wake up in a panic, the ringing still echoing in my ears, even after I'd turned off every phone and disconnected the landline. I would get up, check the door to make sure no one had entered, but the apartment was always locked, always secure. But something was wrong. One night, after yet another sleepless evening of being driven mad by the ringing, I decided I had to confront it. I had to find out who was on the other end. It was a Friday night, and I had a strange feeling that tonight would be different. The air was thick with tension, like something was waiting for me to make the first move. So, at exactly 2:30 a.m., when the phone rang again, I answered. I picked it up and pressed it to my ear, heart pounding in my chest, expecting the same silence. Instead, I heard something new, a voice, a low, raspy whisper that sounded like it was coming from the very depths of the earth. "Come closer," it said. "We're waiting for you." The words sent a shock of terror through me, freezing me in place. I dropped the phone, stumbling back, my body trembling with fear. But then the voice came again. "Don't run," it whispered. You can't hide." I slammed the phone down, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind racing. What the hell was that? Was I losing my mind? I needed to get out of that apartment, but something was stopping me. I felt drawn to it, as if the very walls of the place were closing in around me. The next day, I went down to the landlord's office, desperate for answers. I needed to know if anyone had lived in the apartment before me, if there was something I was missing. The landlord was sitting behind his desk, eyes narrowed as I walked in. When I told him about the calls, he just stared at me, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't say anything for a long moment, but when he did, it was in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it. "It's not the calls you should be worried about," he said. "It's the silence. It's been here long before you ever moved in, and it's never really gone." I was about to ask him what he meant when he cut me off. "Get out, while you still can." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't stay long enough to ask. I ran back to the apartment, grabbed whatever I could, and left. The landlord never showed up again, and I never saw anyone living in the building after that. I don't know who or what was calling me, but I know one thing for sure: it wasn't human. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear it, a faint ringing in the back of my mind, a reminder that something's waiting somewhere in the silence, and it never really stops calling. I had always been a skeptic, the kind of person who scoffed at tales of haunted houses, mysterious disappearances, and strange happenings that couldn't be explained. But that was before I moved into the old farmhouse at the edge of town. It was an old, decrepit place, isolated from the rest of civilization, with only a handful of homes scattered across the land, most of which were abandoned. I had been looking for something to escape to, somewhere to be alone and reflect on my life. The house was cheap, too cheap, but I thought nothing of it. I didn't care much for the dark history I'd heard about the place, the rumors of previous tenants vanishing without a trace, of eerie lights seen flickering in the windows late at night, of strange sounds coming from the cellar. I convinced myself they were just stories, nothing more. The first few weeks in the house were quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, suffocating you. I spent my days cleaning the dusty floors and fixing up the old furniture. There was a sense of comfort in the isolation, as though the world had forgotten me, and I liked it that way. But everything changed the night I found the door. It was in the farthest corner of the house, hidden behind a thick curtain of cobwebs and dust. I had never noticed it before, not once. It was small, old, and out of place. It was like it didn't belong to the house at all, as if it had been put there to keep something in, or to keep something out. The door was locked, but there was no key, no sign of a handle, just a small, rusted latch that refused to budge, no matter how hard I pulled on it. Something inside me urged me to leave it alone, but curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't just ignore it. I tried every method I could think of to open it, from searching through the rest of the house for a key to using tools to pry it open, but nothing worked. That's when I heard the first noise. It was faint at first, just a soft creak from the other side of the door, as though someone or something was trying to get out. I thought it was my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me after days of isolation. But then the sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft scratching, like nails dragging across wood. I froze, a chill running down my spine. I backed away from the door, heart pounding, but couldn't tear my eyes away from it. That night I tried to sleep, but the noise didn't stop. It continued, growing louder and more frantic with each passing hour, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was on the other side. The next morning, I grabbed a crowbar, my hands trembling as I approached the door once again. I pried it open, the latch breaking with a sickening crack. The air on the other side was stale, thick with the scent of decay and rot. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic. It was completely empty, save for a single object in the center of the floor, a large, ornate mirror. The glass was cracked, shattered into countless pieces, but I could still see my reflection staring back at me. But something was wrong. My reflection didn't look like me. The person in the mirror was smiling, grinning in a way that was not natural. The smile was wide, stretched far beyond what should have been humanly possible, its edges curling in a grotesque, eerie way. And then I noticed something else. In the reflection behind me was a figure. It was barely visible at first, hidden in the shadows, but as I stared, it began to emerge, slowly at first, then all at once. A tall, thin man in tattered clothing, his face obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me. I tried to turn around, but there was nothing behind me. I spun back to the mirror, my breath caught in my throat, and the figure was still there, standing behind me, closer than before. His eyes were glowing, an unnatural light piercing through the darkness. They were full of malice, of something far darker than I had ever seen, and I could feel the weight of his gaze, the crushing pressure as though he were inside my mind, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Couldn't look away. The man stepped forward in the reflection, and for the first time, I saw his face. It was twisted, a grotesque mockery of a human being, with eyes that were nothing but empty, soulless pits, and a mouth that was stretched impossibly wide. His smile was not a smile at all. It was a scream, a rictus grin that made my stomach churn. The reflection reached out to touch the glass, and I felt a coldness spread across my chest, as though he were touching me. Couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the reflection vanished. The mirror returned to normal, and I was left standing alone in the room, gasping for air, my legs trembling beneath me. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind that door wasn't finished with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt wrong, as though something was watching me, waiting. And then the scratching came again, from inside the walls, from beneath the floor, from behind every door. It was everywhere, a constant, unrelenting noise, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I could hear the whispers, too, low, indistinct voices calling my name, beckoning me to come back. But I knew better now. Whatever was behind that door, whatever had been trapped there, it was still here, and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I left the house the next morning, never looking back. I didn't care about the rent, the belongings I had left behind, the life I had thought I was escaping. I just had to get away. But even now, I can still hear the scratching. And every time I close my eyes, I see his face. It's been months, but the nightmares haven't stopped. That mirror, the door, it's still there, somewhere, calling me back. And no matter how far I run, I know one thing for certain. I can never escape it. I never believed in curses or superstitions, but everything changed the day I found the shop. It wasn't like any store I had ever seen before. Hidden down a dark alley in the oldest part of town, the narrow, cobblestone street seemed to swallow the light from the dim street lamps, creating an eerie sense of isolation. I had been walking aimlessly, trying to clear my head after a long week at work, when something caught my eye. A shop, tucked between two buildings, its windows barely visible through layers of grime and dust. The sign above the door read V. Sutherland's Curiosities. with no other indication of what lay inside. A strange pull tugged at me, a curiosity that I couldn't shake. I stepped in, the bell above the door ringing with a sharp, unnerving jangle. The air inside was thick, musty, the smell of old wood and forgotten things wrapping around me like a shroud. The shop was cramped, filled with strange objects. Ancient books with cracked spines, odd trinkets, glass bottles filled with what appeared to be unknown liquids, and clocks that ticked erratically. But what drew my attention, what made my heart skip a beat, were the mannequins. They were everywhere, standing still, their blank faces frozen in expressions of eternal emptiness. Some were dressed in old, faded clothing, while others were simply draped in sheets, their limbs awkwardly posed. But there was something unsettling about them, something unnatural that made my skin crawl. The longer I stood there, the more I felt their eyes on me, the hollow sockets following my every movement. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't escape the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath, turning to the counter where a frail, elderly man stood. His face was pale, his eyes deep-set, but his smile was wide and unsettling. "Looking for something, young man?" he asked in a voice that was strangely melodic, yet distant, as if it echoed from somewhere far away. I glanced around at the mannequins again, my unease growing. No, I'm just browsing," I replied, but my voice felt thin, almost weak. The man nodded, his smile not fading, his gaze never leaving me. But you were drawn to them, aren't you? The mannequins." My heart raced. I didn't answer, but I could feel a knot form in my stomach. "They've been here a long time," the man continued. "Each one tells a story, a tragedy, a wish, a curse." I tried to step back, to turn away, but my legs felt frozen. The man's voice grew softer, almost a whisper now. "They can talk, you know, but only to those who listen." I laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. Right, well, I should probably get going. But before I could move, the man's voice stopped me dead in my tracks. "You're not going anywhere until you listen to them," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, commanding. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a cold pressure weigh on my chest, as though something unseen was closing in around me. My pulse quickened, and I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the shop itself had trapped me inside. The man's laugh echoed in my ears, low and cruel, as he slowly stepped back into the shadows, disappearing behind the mannequins. I was left alone, the shop now eerily silent. But the mannequins weren't silent. They began to shift, just slightly at first, their heads tilting ever so slightly towards me. Then, their mouths began to move, twitching and curling in unnatural ways, whispering to one another. I could hear snippets of broken words, whispers that made no sense, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of pain, the sound of desperation. "Help me," one of them whispered, its voice a rasping, gravelly sound that sent shivers through my spine. "Let me out." The words came from one of the mannequins near the back of the room, its eyes now wide, its body twitching unnervingly. I stumbled back, my heart racing as another mannequin's head snapped around to face me. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were all trying to speak at once. "They're all cursed," the voice of another mannequin murmured, its lips parting to reveal rows of jagged, broken teeth. "We were once like you, curious, but curiosity killed us." The mannequins shifted, the ground beneath my feet trembling as the entire room seemed to come alive, their movements jerky and unsettling. I felt their eyes on me, cold and empty, watching me, waiting for something. The whispers filled my ears, louder now, urgent, desperate. "We are trapped," another voice croaked. "They can't escape. Neither will you." A sudden, terrible realization gripped me. These were not just mannequins. They were people. They had been cursed, turned into these lifeless forms, forever bound to the shop, forever trapped in a prison of glass and cloth. And now they wanted me to join them. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. But the mannequins didn't stop. They began to move towards me, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they shuffled across the floor, dragging their stiff bodies toward me. "Listen to us," they hissed. "We won't let you leave." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on me as I realized there was no escape. The mannequins were everywhere now, closing in from all sides, their whispers growing louder, their voices a cacophony of despair and fury. My body froze, my mind screaming for me to move, to run, but I couldn't. The shop seemed to have a hold on me, keeping me paralyzed, unable to escape. And then, as if on cue, the man's voice returned, soft and chilling. "Welcome to your new home. You will never leave." The last thing I remember is the mannequins reaching out, their cold hands brushing against my skin, pulling me toward them, their whispers filling my ears as everything went dark. Now I stand in the shop just like them. I am one of them. My body is stiff, my mouth forever locked in a silent scream, my eyes staring blankly into the void. And I can only watch as the next curious soul steps into the shop, just like I did, unaware of the fate awaiting them. But soon they'll hear the whispers too. Soon they'll know that there is no escape. And when they look into the glass, they'll see me, staring back at them, trapped forever in the cursed shop of V. Sutherland's Curiosities. I didn't believe in ghosts, at least I didn't until that night. I had always been the type to laugh at ghost stories, dismissing them as nothing more than exaggerated tales spun by the imagination. But as I sat on that cold, empty platform, the wind howling through the dark streets of the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had been a long day at work, and I was desperate to get home. I hadn't seen anyone for hours, which was unusual for this part of the city, especially at this time of night. The streets should have been alive with people heading home from their late shifts, but instead, everything felt eerie, as though the world had suddenly gone silent, leaving me alone with my thoughts. It was nearly midnight, and the train I had been waiting for had yet to arrive. I checked my watch again, feeling a growing sense of unease gnawing at my insides. The station was supposed to be bustling, but instead, the only sounds were the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional rustle of papers caught in the wind. There were no other passengers around, not even a station attendant in sight. The platform stretched endlessly in both directions, and the flickering overhead lights seemed to add to the sense of desolation. It was as if the whole place had been abandoned, forgotten by time itself. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, irritated by the delay. My mind kept wandering to the strange stories I'd heard about this old station. People said it was cursed, that strange things happened here at night. They spoke of a train that only appeared when the moon was hidden behind clouds, a train that never took anyone anywhere. It was an old legend, one that I had laughed off every time I heard it. But tonight something felt different. I glanced down the tracks, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows, watching me, but the tracks were empty, as they had been for the last half hour. The train's delay was becoming more than just an inconvenience. It was becoming unsettling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a chill swept through the air, and I pulled my coat tighter around myself. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving at the far end of the platform. At first, I thought it was just the flickering lights playing tricks on my eyes, but then it moved again, slow and deliberate, and I felt my heart race. My body froze. There was no one else here. Who could it be? I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the shadow grew closer, its figure becoming clearer with each passing second. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, his face obscured by the brim of a dark, worn-out hat. He didn't walk, he glided, his feet not quite touching the ground. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. My body was paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. As he drew closer, the air around me grew colder, and I could feel my breath becoming visible in the dim light. His presence was suffocating, as though he had stepped out of a nightmare, and my every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. His eyes, when I finally saw them, were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light around them, and I could feel his gaze piercing through me, cold and unfeeling. He stopped in front of me, his breath coming in short, rasping gasps, though I couldn't see his mouth move. He raised one bony finger, pointing toward the train tracks. His voice was a low whisper, barely audible over the howling wind. "It's almost time," he muttered, his voice strange and distorted, like it was being filtered through 100 different voices at once. "The train is coming." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't make a sound. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears as I looked past him to the tracks. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another illusion, but as the seconds ticked by, it became clearer. A faint light appeared in the distance, moving slowly down the tracks, growing brighter as it approached. The train. It was real, but there was something wrong about it, something horribly wrong. It was an old, rusted locomotive, the kind that hadn't been seen in decades. The paint on its sides was peeling, and the windows were blacked out, as if no one inside wanted to be seen. The train screeched to a halt just a few feet from where I stood, the sound of the brakes grinding through my skull. The doors creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond them. The man, still standing unnervingly close to me, leaned in, his voice a soft, rasping whisper. "It's your choice now," he said, his words sending a wave of nausea through me. "Board the train or be left behind." Before I could process what he was saying, the doors of the train slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the locomotive lurched forward. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I watched it disappear into the distance. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the train was gone, leaving nothing but an eerie silence behind. The wind died down and the station was still again. No train, no shadow, just the overwhelming feeling of emptiness. I stood there, breathless, trying to piece together what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it some kind of twisted hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But deep down, I knew better. The whispers of the old legends echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder that the train had come, and it wasn't just a story. It was real, and the man had been right. It was my choice. But now, as I look back at that empty platform, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I had boarded the train? Would it have taken me to a place I would never return from? Would I have been trapped, like so many before me, on a never-ending journey to nowhere? Or would I have been left to face whatever darkness still lurks in that station, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to stay? I don't know why I went inside that house. Maybe it was curiosity or some twisted need to feel the thrill of fear, but the moment I crossed the threshold, I regretted it. The house had been abandoned for years, or at least that's what I'd been told. The locals warned me to stay away from it, but I was young and stubborn, thinking I was immune to the stories of ghosts and strange happenings. It stood there, in the middle of a decaying neighborhood, like a relic from some forgotten time, a dark, looming presence that refused to be forgotten despite the passage of decades. The windows were boarded up, the wooden door was rotting, and the paint was peeling off in sheets. But it wasn't the decaying exterior that drew me in, it was the legend. The house was said to hold the names of those who once lived there, carved into the walls in strange symbols that no one could understand. They say if you stand in the house long enough, you can hear the names being whispered, as if the house itself is alive, feeding off the souls that pass through it. That's what the locals say anyway. I didn't believe it. I thought it was just superstition, a scare tactic to keep outsiders away. But when I stepped inside, I immediately felt something was off. The air was thick, like I was breathing in something ancient and forgotten. The darkness seemed to cling to the walls, pressing in on me from all sides. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I shivered, not from the cold but from the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the space. The air felt heavy, as if something was watching me, waiting. My heart started pounding in my chest as I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The walls were covered in mold, the floor was littered with dust, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. But there was something else, something far worse. It was a sense of familiarity, as if I had been here before. I couldn't explain it. I had never set foot in this house in my life, yet it felt like it knew me, like it was waiting for me. I wandered deeper, drawn to a narrow staircase that led up to the second floor. The stairs creaked underfoot, each step feeling like a warning. I reached the top and immediately turned into the first room I saw, a small, dimly lit space. There was a strange scent in the air, faint but pungent, like something had been burned in here a long time ago. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. It was an old wooden chair, covered in a thin layer of dust. But it wasn't the chair that caught my attention. It was the wall behind it. The wall was covered in names, hundreds of names, carved deep into the wood, their edges jagged and uneven. At first, I thought they were just random markings, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Some of the names were familiar. I could have sworn I recognized them. I leaned in closer, my breath caught in my throat, and the whispers started. Soft at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with every passing second. "They're coming for you." The voice was a whisper, so faint that I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, this time clearer, closer. "You're next." My heart raced as I turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. The whispers continued, rising in volume until they were a deafening roar. "You're one of them now. You belong to the house." Panic surged through me, my body trembling as I backed away from the wall, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. But there was no explanation, no logic. The names on the wall seemed to move, shifting, rearranging themselves into new patterns, as if they were alive. My eyes darted back to the door, but before I could reach it, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, like someone walking in my shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, but the room was still empty. Only the names remained, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You should have left when you had the chance." I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer alone in this house. Something had changed. Something had taken hold of me, and I could feel it deep inside me, like a cold hand wrapping around my heart. My eyes darted to the door again, and without thinking, I bolted for it. I ran through the hallways, the whispers following me, echoing off the walls. I could hear them calling my name now, a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, their words distorted and unnatural. "You're here forever. You'll never leave." I slammed into the door, desperately trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I screamed, pushing against it with all my strength, but the door remained locked, as if the house itself was keeping me inside. Then I heard a voice, low and guttural, coming from behind me. "It's too late," it rasped. "You should have left when you had the chance." I turned around, my body frozen in terror as I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing at the end of the hallway. Its eyes were black pits, empty voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. The whispers grew louder, the walls seemed to close in around me, and I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before me. I was now part of it, my name carved into its walls, lost to time. And as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I realized something even worse. The house wasn't just waiting for me. It was waiting for everyone. Each soul that walked through its door would become another name on its walls, another lost spirit trapped in its endless corridors, unable to escape, unable to remember who they once were. I tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came. I was already gone, just another forgotten name in a house that would never let me leave. And somewhere, deep within the walls, the whispers started again, this time with a new name. "Mine. You're here forever," they hissed, "just like the others." I never believed in ghost stories or anything supernatural until I stumbled upon that forsaken town. It wasn't marked on any map, and not a soul could recall its name. Yet it existed, hidden in the thick woods beyond the reach of modern civilization. It was the kind of place that felt wrong the moment you entered, like the earth itself was trying to swallow you whole, as if it had been abandoned for a reason no one dared to speak of. I found it while hiking through the woods, chasing an old rumor about a lost settlement that had vanished overnight without a trace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing at the edge of a crumbling dirt road, the fog curling up around my boots like the fingers of something far older than the land itself. The town was eerily quiet, with old, dilapidated buildings lining the streets, their windows shattered and doors hanging off their hinges, the wood groaning in protest against the decay. But there was something about the place that made my skin crawl, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, of something lurking just out of sight. The air was thick with a suffocating stillness, as though time had stopped in this place, frozen in a moment that no one could escape. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I pushed forward, driven by the need to discover what had happened to this forsaken town. It wasn't until I reached the center of the town that I saw it. A massive, decaying church that loomed over everything else, its steeple reaching up into the darkening sky like a twisted finger pointing towards some unknowable place. There were no signs of life, but there was a peculiar hum, a low, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. I hesitated for only a moment before pushing open the rotting doors and stepping inside. The interior was nothing like I'd expected. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling of presence, something tangible, something suffocating. The air was cold, unnaturally cold, as if the very walls exhaled a breath that was older than the earth itself. And then there was the smell, a rancid, sweet odor, like something had died and been left to rot long ago. The pews were covered in dust, and the stained glass windows, cracked and shattered, allowed only slivers of moonlight to filter through. I stepped forward, drawn to the altar where an ancient book lay open. I don't know why I felt compelled to approach it. Maybe it was the strange symbols on the pages, or maybe it was something deeper, some dark force pulling me closer. As I reached for the book, the ground beneath me trembled, and I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper, but a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Leave this place," it warned, but it was too late. My fingers grazed the pages, and everything changed. The air thickened, and the shadows in the corners of the church seemed to stretch and writhe. I turned to leave, but the doors had vanished. The walls closed in, and the once silent town erupted into a chorus of distorted whispers, each one calling my name. As I backed away from the altar, I stumbled upon a set of stairs leading down into the earth. Without thinking, I descended, my heart racing with fear and uncertainty. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the darkness became, until it swallowed everything. My breath, my thoughts, my very sense of reality. I reached the bottom, finding myself in a cavernous underground chamber, lit only by flickering, sickly green flames that seemed to have no source. And there, in the center, stood a massive stone altar, shaped like a mouth, its jagged teeth gaping open. It was then that I saw them, the eyes, hundreds of them, all staring at me from the shadows, their gleaming pupils reflecting a malevolent hunger. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of tortured souls, each voice calling to me, begging me to understand, to remember what had been forgotten. I tried to turn and run, but my legs refused to move. It was as if the very ground had a hold on me, roots of some dark force that kept me rooted in place. The altar groaned, and I heard a voice, deep and echoing, rise from the darkness. "You have entered," it said, "and now you must stay." The room seemed to spin around me as the ground cracked open, and from the depths of the earth, something began to rise. It wasn't a creature, not in any sense that I could comprehend. It was more like a presence, a force, an ancient evil that had slumbered beneath the town, waiting for someone foolish enough to awaken it. The air thickened, and I felt its weight press down on me, crushing the life out of me, suffocating me in its dark embrace. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and then I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, emerged from the abyss, its form flickering like a broken reflection in a mirror. Its eyes, those eyes, burned with an eternal hunger, and I realized then what it was. It was the town, and it was alive, a living nightmare that fed on the souls of the lost. It reached toward me with elongated fingers, and as it touched my skin, a wave of agony coursed through my body. I screamed, but the scream was swallowed by the darkness, by the town that had claimed me. I tried to pull away, but the grip was unrelenting, and as I gazed into those endless eyes, I saw everything, everyone. Those who had come before me, trapped in the same hellish cycle, their faces twisted in eternal torment. And I understood. I understood the curse of this place, the reason it had been abandoned, why no one dared to speak of it. The town wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a dark, living entity that fed on the souls of the lost, ensnaring anyone foolish enough to wander into its grip. And now it had me. As the figure pulled me deeper into the shadows, the whispers faded, and all that remained was the suffocating silence of the forgotten town, waiting for the next soul to wander in. I had become one of them, just another name lost in the echo of its dark hunger. And I knew then, with terrifying clarity, that this town would never let me leave, and no one would ever know the truth about the echoes of the forgotten town. I never believed in things I couldn't see or touch, and for years, my life was driven by logic, science, and the steady beat of my 9-to-5 routine. That was until I bought the house at the edge of the woods, a house that, despite its old age and the decaying exterior, called to me. It was an inheritance from a distant relative I never knew existed, and something about it felt wrong from the moment I first set foot on its creaky porch. The realtor, a thin, pale man with a vacant gaze, had told me that the house had been empty for decades. But there was an urgency in his voice, a warning buried between the lines of his otherwise perfect sales pitch. I should have listened to the chills that ran down my spine the day I first saw it. The house had an energy, something almost alive, as if it had been waiting, watching. The first night I spent there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The walls groaned as if the house itself was stretching and waking up. The windows rattled in the breeze, and every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. It wasn't like a normal house. It didn't feel like a home at all. It felt like something that had been built for the sole purpose of keeping me there. I tried to dismiss the unease as my imagination, but then things started to change. The first time it happened, I came home to find all my furniture moved. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe I had shifted things around while cleaning without realizing. But as the days passed, I found more and more things out of place. Books I never remembered touching were stacked differently on shelves. Chairs I had never moved were suddenly turned toward the wall, and at night, I would hear whispers that didn't make sense. The worst part? The house seemed to know me. It knew my habits, my routines, things I had never told anyone. I'd hear footsteps following me even when I was alone, or see reflections of myself in the mirrors that weren't quite my own. The figure I saw in the mirror one morning wasn't my reflection at all. It was someone else, standing right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. I thought I was losing my mind. But then the house escalated. Every time I tried to leave, something would stop me. The door would be locked, no matter how many times I tried the key, or a cold gust of wind would slam the door shut, as if the house itself was holding me prisoner. The windows wouldn't open, and the more I struggled to escape, the stronger the house's grip became. It was like the house knew my every move, anticipating me, trapping me with its overwhelming presence. I began to have dreams, nightmares, more like where I was back in the house, but this time it wasn't just watching me. The house was trying to consume me, pulling me into its very foundation, its walls, its floors, as though it was hungry for something I didn't understand. I woke up every morning feeling more and more disconnected from the world, my reflection in the mirror starting to fade, becoming indistinct, like the house was slowly erasing me from existence. And that's when I found it. Hidden in the attic, tucked away beneath the floorboards, was a journal. It belonged to the house's original owner, a man who had lived alone, consumed by an obsession with building a place that could know its inhabitants better than they knew themselves. As I read his frantic scribblings, it became clear that the house wasn't just built from wood and stone. It was built from thoughts, from memories, from souls. The man had used forbidden rituals, feeding the house with his fears, his regrets, and the echoes of others he had trapped over the years. His journal ended abruptly, a final sentence scrawled in blood. "The house knows you, and it will never let you go." I thought that if I could leave, if I could break the connection, I'd be free. But I was wrong. The house had already bound me, and the worst part, I could feel it, even as I tried to flee, clawing at the edges of my mind, whispering my name at night when the lights were out, pulling me back. I tried to burn the journal, tried to destroy everything that tied me to the house, but it was as if the house had anticipated that too. It knew my every move, my every thought. I couldn't escape. No one could. The house didn't just know me, it was me. It was part of me, connected to my very essence, feeding off my every breath, my every thought, until there would be nothing left of me at all but the whispers that filled the walls. And one by one, as days turned into months, I saw the other souls who had been trapped here before me. their faces appearing in mirrors and windows, faded, hollowed-out versions of themselves, like echoes that had once lived here, now nothing more than an imprint in the fabric of the house. I tried to fight, to break free, but every attempt made the house stronger. I had become a prisoner in my own mind, trapped within its walls, a part of its never-ending hunger. And now, as I sit here in the dark, staring at the walls that seem to pulse and breathe, I realize there is no escape. The house will never let me go. It never lets anyone go. It knows me. It knows everything about me. It knows my every fear, my every regret, my every secret. And as I sit here, writing these words, I can feel the house shifting again, the walls closing in, ready to pull me deeper into its endless maw. And maybe, just maybe, someone else will come across this story. Someone like I once was, someone who believes that they can escape. But if you ever hear the whispers of a house that knows you, do not listen. Do not go, because once the house knows you, it will never let you leave. I never thought it would be me, standing at the center of this nightmare. But here I am, trapped, alone, with nothing but the soft, persistent hum of an unnatural wind swirling around me, whispering secrets I couldn't even begin to comprehend. It started innocently enough. An invitation from an old friend I hadn't seen in years, someone who had slipped through the cracks of my life. The message was simple: come visit me at my new place. It's secluded, quiet, perfect for a getaway. At first, I thought it was just a joke. My friend, Jason, was always fond of the dramatic, playing with my nerves, pulling me into some weird situation for laughs. But this time there was something different. Something about the message felt off. Maybe it was the urgency, or maybe it was the way the words seemed to be written in haste, like someone else had been forcing him to write them. I convinced myself it was just paranoia, a sign that I was getting too old to be invited into reckless situations, and I dismissed it. But the thought of it lingered. There was something unsettling about the place he described in his message. An isolated cabin deep in the woods, far from any trace of civilization, with no neighbors for miles. Something about the idea of it seemed to whisper directly into my gut, filling me with a sensation I couldn't explain. But when I arrived, the cabin seemed innocent enough. It was nothing like the twisted picture I had imagined in my head. A rustic home, tucked into a clearing surrounded by trees that seemed to lean in, forming a protective circle around the house. It looked cozy, even inviting, so much so that my doubts started to slip away. Jason wasn't home yet when I arrived, so I decided to wait inside, unpack, and make myself comfortable, eager to reconnect after so many years apart. But the longer I stayed, the more strange things became. At first, it was small things, objects misplaced, shadows that moved in the corner of my eye, sounds I couldn't place. I chalked it up to the isolation, the weird acoustics of a place that was too quiet, too removed from the world. But as dusk approached, the atmosphere thickened. The air grew colder, and the wind picked up, making the house groan as if it were alive, settling into the earth with every gust. That's when I first heard it, the call. It was faint at first, a voice coming from the woods, too soft to make out, but unmistakable in its tone, like someone was whispering my name. I thought it was Jason coming back early, playing a prank. But when I went outside to check, there was nothing. No sign of him, no movement in the trees, just the wind, picking up again, swaying the branches with an eerie rhythm. I laughed to myself, brushing it off, but that laugh quickly faded when the calling came again. Louder this time, more urgent. My name, unmistakable, drawn out into a sound that sent shivers down my spine. But Jason never returned that night, and as the hours passed, the call grew stronger. At first, I told myself it was some kind of animal, something caught in the wind, but no animal could imitate the exact cadence of a human voice. Could it? The voice wasn't just calling my name, it was asking for something. I couldn't understand what it wanted, but every time the wind died down, I would hear it, so clear now, so close. My curiosity got the better of me, and against every instinct I had, I stepped outside again. The night was thick with fog now, the moon barely visible through the swirling mist. I called out for Jason, my voice shaky, but there was no answer, only the silence. And then the voice again, coming from deep within the trees, as though it were speaking directly into my soul. "Come closer." It beckoned, the sound too sweet, too wrong. I don't know what possessed me, but I found myself walking into the woods, drawn forward by something I could neither see nor understand. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the air grew colder, the silence deeper, broken only by that voice. It was like something was tugging at the fabric of reality itself, pulling me deeper into the forest, until I came upon something that froze me in place. In the center of a small clearing stood a figure. At first, I thought it was Jason, but as I moved closer, I realized it was not him. It was a shape, tall, gaunt, its features obscured by shadow. Yet there was an unmistakable sense of familiarity, something in the stance, the way it stood in the dim light. The thing spoke again, its voice coming from all directions, echoing around me. "You should not have come." I froze, terror flooding my system as I realized it wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking through me. It knew me. It knew things about me, things only I should have known. That's when the realization hit me. This wasn't just a figure in the woods. This was something far worse, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me, and all those years of doubt, all those moments I thought were coincidences, had been leading me here. The calling had been a trap, pulling me in, manipulating my every thought. I could feel the presence of Jason now, not in the way I expected, but in the way he had become a part of this forest, this nightmare. The woods seemed to pulse, alive with the energy of something not human, and I understood that I had walked into something that didn't belong in this world. The figure stepped closer, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, burning with a hunger that went beyond death. It didn't want anything from me. It needed me like a virus, feeding off my fear. The air thickened with dread, my breath coming in short bursts as I felt the weight of the thing pressing into me, suffocating me. There was no escape. No matter how fast I ran, how far I went, I would always hear it calling. My name, twisted, drenched in malice, pulling me back. It would never stop. And as I felt the cold hands of the woods wrap around my throat, I realized with horror that Jason was never meant to save me. He had been brought here too. We were both just bait, part of the ritual that had bound this place to the earth. And now there was no way out, no way back. The silent call would continue, waiting for the next person to hear it, to come close, to listen. And they would never leave. I never believed in things like curses or supernatural forces, but that was before I came across it. The mirror, it wasn't something I sought out. It found me, in the darkest corner of a thrift store, where strange things were always hidden among the clutter of old furniture and dusty trinkets. I was looking for something to decorate my new apartment, something cheap, when I noticed it. A full-length mirror with a frame made of dark wood that seemed almost too perfect, too well-polished for its age. There was a certain allure to it, a feeling that tugged at me as I walked past, something almost inviting, like it was calling me to take it home. So, I bought it without thinking twice, not realizing that bringing it home would mean inviting something far darker into my life. First, it was just a normal mirror. I hung it up in the hallway, the only place in my apartment that had space for it, and went about my day-to-day routine, forgetting it was even there. But the first night, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling uneasy, like someone was watching me. My eyes shot open, and I immediately looked toward the hallway. That's when I saw it. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just my hallway. It was different. The lights were off, the hallway was darker, but the mirror, it was alive. It wasn't like an ordinary reflection. It felt like a window into something else, something wrong. There was a figure standing in the darkness, its shape shrouded in shadows, but I could see the faintest outline of a face, staring directly at me. Its eyes wide and empty, hollow pits that seemed to gaze into my soul. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Couldn't be real. It was just a trick of the light, a figment of my sleep-deprived mind. But the figure moved. It stepped forward, slowly, almost as if it were approaching me. I jumped out of bed and rushed into the hallway, heart racing, desperate to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But the mirror was empty. No figure, no shadows, just the normal reflection of my hallway. I chalked it up to exhaustion and tried to go back to sleep. But every night after that, it happened again. The mirror would show something different. A presence, a figure, sometimes a shape, sometimes just eyes, always watching, always waiting. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was there. Something trapped behind the glass, something ancient and malevolent. It would happen when I wasn't looking, and when I did glance into the mirror, I'd see those eyes staring back at me, filled with something like hunger, something dark and insatiable. I couldn't leave it behind, though. No matter how terrifying it was, the mirror felt like a part of me. I couldn't break the connection. There was something wrong with it, something pulling me in, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. I started noticing other things too, small, subtle changes. The reflection of my apartment in the mirror would shift, sometimes showing things that weren't there in the real world. I'd see things move in the glass that weren't actually moving in the room, my own reflection walking out of frame when I hadn't moved. I tried to talk to my friends about it, but they didn't believe me. They told me I was stressed, overworked, that I needed to rest. But I knew something was wrong, something sinister. The final breaking point came one night when I couldn't sleep again. I woke up to the sound of whispers coming from the hallway, faint at first, like the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But the more I listened, the more distinct the whispers became. They were calling me, and as if on command, I stood up, my feet moving toward the hallway, my body acting on its own accord, no longer in control. The mirror was there, as it always was, its dark surface reflecting nothing but shadows. But tonight was different. As I approached, I saw the figure again, but this time it wasn't just a shadow. It was solid, tangible. A woman. Her hair was long and tangled, her skin pale, her face a twisted mask of despair, her eyes black, voids that seemed to swallow all light. She stepped out of the mirror, her hand reaching toward me, and I screamed. I turned and ran, but she followed, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the hallway, her whispers growing louder, sharper. "Come back," she hissed. "You can't leave now. You belong to me." I couldn't escape. No matter how fast I ran, how many doors I closed behind me, she was always there, just beyond the threshold of my vision. Her breath hot on my neck, her fingers brushing against my skin. I tried to tear the mirror off the wall, tried to destroy it, but it felt as if the mirror itself was alive, fighting me back, sending shocks through my body every time I touched it, the pain unbearable, and still her voice called out, louder, more desperate, more real. And then the whispers stopped. The mirror went black. Everything was silent, like the world itself had been sucked into the glass, leaving nothing but a void. That's when I understood. I had been chosen. The mirror had claimed me. It wasn't just a cursed object. It was a portal, a prison, a gateway to something worse, something that fed on souls. The woman, the one I thought was haunting me, she was just the beginning. The mirror wasn't just a reflection of the world. It was a doorway to it, and once you were inside, there was no way out. Now I'm trapped, wandering endlessly in the reflection, unable to escape the endless darkness that lies just beyond the glass. The mirror's edge has become my prison, and the whispers never stop. They call to me, they haunt me, and they always will. I only hope someone comes across the mirror someday and sees what I see. But even if they do, they won't be able to help. It's too late for me. It will always be too late. I never believed in monsters, but that was before I met him, the Hollow Man. It all started on a cold night in late November. I was alone in my apartment, sitting by the window, staring out into the empty streets, when I heard a soft knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and at first, I thought it was the wind, maybe something falling outside. But then the knock came again, a little more persistent this time, like someone was standing right on the other side. I felt my pulse quicken, a strange chill running down my spine. I hesitated before walking toward the door, unsure of what to expect. My hand shook as I gripped the doorknob and slowly turned it. When I opened the door, no one was there. The hallway was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's lights, flickering above me. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then I saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper lying at my doorstep. I bent down and picked it up. The note was simple, handwritten in jagged, unsettling handwriting that seemed almost erratic. "He's watching you," it said. My heart skipped a beat, a rush of anxiety flooding my chest. I scanned the hallway, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. I slammed the door shut, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, I kept hearing strange noises at night. Scratching, faint whispering, like someone was breathing just behind me. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my body stiff with fear. But when I looked around, there was no one there. It was always quiet, just the dark, empty apartment around me, or so I thought. One evening, I decided to stay up late, determined to get to the bottom of what was happening. I sat in the living room, the lights dimmed low, my eyes glued to the door, and that's when I saw him. He was standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the shadows. A man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a strange black veil. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them, those hollow, empty pits where eyes should be. His face was smooth, featureless, and the darkness around him seemed to warp, like he wasn't entirely in the same reality as me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. His presence was suffocating. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me, as if waiting for something. As I stared into the darkness where he stood, I realized that I couldn't remember how long he had been there. Time felt like it had stopped, like everything was suspended in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. Suddenly, the man began to move, slowly, unnaturally, like a puppet with its strings cut. He glided toward me, his feet never touching the ground. He didn't make a sound, not even the faintest rustle of fabric or movement. The silence was deafening, and yet my ears seemed to be ringing, like I could hear the beat of my own panicked heart. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. My body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear I had never known. He stepped closer, and I could feel the air grow colder. His hand reached out, long, spindly fingers brushing against the edge of my vision. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what I knew was coming, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes were locked on him, unable to break the gaze. And then, with a voice that was more a whisper in my head than anything spoken aloud, he said, "You're mine now." I screamed, or at least I tried to. The sound was muffled, as if I was underwater, and yet I was wide awake. I tried to run, but my legs were still frozen. The hollow man stepped closer, and his presence seemed to suck the very air from the room. His fingers brushed against my cheek, cold as ice, and I felt like my soul was being drained from me, as if he was taking something vital with every touch. My vision blurred, and I felt myself slipping away, being pulled into a darkness deeper than anything I had ever known. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor in a cold sweat. The lights were still dim, the door still closed, but something was different. The shadows seemed to linger longer than they should have, stretching out unnaturally, as if they were watching me. I tried to convince myself it was all a dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The hollow man was real, and he had left something behind. Days passed, and I tried to continue my life as normal, but everything felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed, that there was always someone just out of sight. At night, I would hear soft whispers in the dark, and I would see his shadow standing in the corner of my room, just out of reach. I tried to leave, to escape, but wherever I went, he followed. He was always there, always watching, always waiting. It was as if he had become part of me, a parasite feeding on my fear, on my very soul. The worst part was that I couldn't fight him, couldn't escape him. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many locks I put on the door, he was always there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to break. I realized then that the hollow man wasn't just a presence. He was a shadow, a nightmare that followed you, always one step ahead. He fed on fear, and once he had you, there was no escape. I had become his, and now, no matter where I went, I could feel his cold hand on my shoulder, his hollow eyes watching me from the dark, waiting for the day when I would finally break. There is no escape from the hollow man. And now, as I sit here writing this, I know that you can feel him too. He's watching you, waiting, and one day you'll feel his cold fingers on your neck, and you'll know that there is nowhere left to run. You'll be his, just like me.